My wife of 40 years did not just ask for a divorce. She threw my life into 2 black garbage bags and changed the locks while I was out fishing. She thought she took everything the house worth, $2 million, the bank accounts, the luxury cars, even my dignity. She thought she had won, but she forgot. One thing, one small dusty piece of paper buried in a safe deposit box since 1980, and that piece of paper was about to turn her victory lap into a living nightmare. Before I tell you how I brought an entire empire down without raising my voice, hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments. If you have ever been underestimated by the people you loved the most, my name is Desmond, and this is how I taught my family a lesson they will never forget. The metal key scraped against the lock cylinder, refusing to turn. I jiggled it, thinking maybe the humidity in Atlanta had swollen the wood of the front door again. I knew every inch of this door because I had installed it myself. 30 years ago, solid oak, heavy enough to stop a bullet and polished until it shone like dark honey. But the key did not fit. I pulled it out and looked at the grooves, thinking maybe I had grabbed the wrong ring, but I only carried one ring. My truck key and my house key. I tried again, pushing harder this time, feeling the resistance of a mechanism that did not know me anymore. Then I heard the click, not from my key, but from the other side. The heavy door swung open, but it was not my wife. Vivian standing there. It was Brad, my son-in-law. He was leaning against the doorframe, holding a bottle of craft beer, a smug grin plastered across his face like he had just won the lottery. He did not move to let me in. He just stood there blocking the entrance to the home I built with my own 2 hands. "The key is expired, Des," Brad said, taking a sip of his beer. He did not call me Dad. He did not call me Mr. Perkins. He called me Des with a tone that suggested I was an employee he was firing. "Look at you. Smelling like fish and old bait, you might want to step back. You are going to stain the porch." I looked at him. This man who had never hammered a nail in his life, a man who made his living selling houses. Other people built wearing suits that cost more than my first truck. I tightened my grip on my fishing rod. "Where is Vivian?" I asked, my voice low and steady. I did not have time for his games. Brad laughed, a short bark of a laugh that grated on my nerves. "She is busy packing the rest of your junk, speaking of which." He kicked 2 large suitcases that were sitting behind the door, sending them tumbling down the front steps. They landed on the concrete walkway with a heavy thud. One of them burst open, spilling my work shirts and my old army jacket onto the grass. Vivian stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. She was wearing a white silk blouse and black trousers, an outfit she usually saved for church or high-end parties. She looked immaculate, untouched by the chaos she was creating. She did not look at my eyes. She looked at a spot somewhere over my shoulder as if looking at me directly would dirty her soul. "Desmond, we are done," she said, her voice cold, devoid of any emotion. It sounded rehearsed, like lines she had been practicing in the mirror. "I filed the papers this morning. My lawyer will call you. Do not try to come in." I stood there on the driveway, the afternoon sun beating down on my neck. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my spine, but I felt cold. Freezing cold. 40 years. I thought 40 years of waking up at 4 in the morning to mix concrete, 40 years of paying bills, 40 years of silence and loyalty. And this was the goodbye. Why, I asked simply. Vivian finally looked at me, and I saw it. The contempt she had been hiding for who knows how long. "Because I am tired. Desmond, I am tired of the grease under your fingernails. I am tired of your silence. I am tired of living with a ghost. Brad has shown me what life can really be like. We are going to sell the house, Desmond, this land. This is worth a fortune, and I am not going to spend my remaining years watching you watch television." Brad stepped forward, placing a possessive hand on Vivian's shoulder, as if he owned her too. "You heard the lady Pops," he said, smirking. "We are taking the house, the Mercedes and the savings account. Consider it compensation for all the years she had to put up with a boring old man like you. Now, be a good boy and leave before I call the cops and tell them a senile old man is trespassing." My hands curled into fists at my sides. I could feel the calluses on my palms. Hard ridges of skin formed by decades of labor. I could have snapped Brad in half. I could have walked up those stairs, pushed past him, and demanded my rights. I could have screamed that I paid for every brick in that wall, every shingle on that roof. But I did not. I looked at the house, my eyes tracing the lines of the foundation. I remembered pouring that concrete in the summer of 1980, checking the soil stability, reinforcing the rebar. I knew exactly where the load-bearing walls were, I knew exactly where the pipes ran, and I knew exactly what lay beneath the surface that neither Brad nor Vivian knew about. I looked at Vivian one last time, waiting for a flicker of regret, a tear, a hesitation, but there was nothing. Just the cold, hard stare of a stranger. She had already moved on in her mind. She was already spending the money from the sale. "Okay," I said, my voice surprisingly calm even to my own ears. Brad blinked, confused by my lack of fight. "That is it. No begging, no crying." I bent down and began gathering my clothes from the lawn, stuffing my army jacket back into the suitcase. I zipped it up and stood straight, looking Brad dead in the eye. "You want the house. Take it," I said. I grabbed the handle of the suitcase and turned to walk toward my rusted Ford pickup truck parked at the curb. The only thing they did not want. The only thing that was truly mine. I opened the truck door and threw the bags in the passenger seat. The metal creaked. A sound of comfort in this madness. Before I climbed in, I turned back, one last time. Brad and Vivian were still standing on the porch watching me like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. "Just one piece of advice," I called out, my voice carrying across the perfect lawn. "Keep an eye on the foundation. Brad, old houses have a way of shifting when the weight changes." Brad laughed, waving me off like a fly. "Get out of here, old man. Go find a nursing home." I climbed into the truck and turned the key. The engine roared to life, coughing a cloud of black smoke that drifted toward the pristine white porch. I put it in gear and drove away slowly. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I did not cry. I did not slam the steering wheel. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing a number I had not called in years. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Marcus, it is Desmond." "Desmond?" Marcus sounded surprised. "I thought you were retired." I said, staring. At the road ahead, my eyes dry and focused. "But I think I just got a new job. I need you to meet me at the old diner on 4th Street. Bring your briefcase and bring the file from 1980, the one marked land lease." There was a pause on the other end, then Marcus chuckled, a low, dry sound that sounded like gravel crunching. "She finally did it, didn't she?" "She did," I replied, turning onto the main road, leaving the wealthy, gated community behind. "She kicked me out. Marcus took the house, took the money, and let me guess," Marcus said, knowing me better than my own wife ever did, "you did not fight back." I smiled for the first time that day, a cold, hard smile that did not reach my eyes. Why would I fight for a house, Marcus, when I own the ground it stands on? I am not going to fight them. I am going to let them sink. I hung up the phone and pressed the accelerator. The old truck surged forward, moving away from the past and into a war they did not even know had started. They thought they had evicted an old man, but they had just awakened a sleeping giant. And as I drove toward the setting sun, I knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of my story. This was just the violent beginning of theirs. The neon sign outside my window buzzed with the sound of a dying insect flashing the words, "Star Motel," in a rhythm that would give a healthy man a migraine. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial lemon cleaner, a combination that settled in the back of my throat and refused to leave. I sat on the edge of the mattress, which sagged in the middle like a hammock, and stared at the peeling beige wallpaper. 3 hours ago, I was the owner of a 5-bedroom estate in the finest district of Atlanta. Now, I was a guest in a room that cost $49 a night and came with free cockroaches. I placed my phone on the scarred laminate of the nightstand and took a deep breath. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. I picked up the phone again and opened my banking app. Face ID recognized me, but the numbers on the screen were strangers. The joint checking account, 0. The savings account, which held the money from the sale of my construction company 5 years ago, 0. Even the emergency fund strictly for medical issues or disasters was drained to the last cent. Vivian had not just locked me out, she had wiped me out. She had planned this meticulously while I was sleeping next to her, while I was fixing the leaky faucet in the master bath, while I was buying her favorite flowers every Friday. She was moving money, she was consulting lawyers, she was erasing 40 years of partnership with a few clicks on a screen. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with heartbreak. I had trusted her with everything in my world. A man works his whole life to build a fortress to keep his family safe. He never expects the enemy to be the one making the coffee in the kitchen. I dialed. Marcus. Again, he picked up on the first ring. The background noise of a baseball game on TV, filling the silence between us. Des, tell me you are not in that Fleabag motel on the highway, Marcus said, his voice rough like sandpaper. It was the only place with a vacancy and cash payment, I said, rubbing my temples. She froze the cards. Marcus, she took it all, every dime. There was a silence on the line, then the sound of glass shattering. Marcus had probably thrown his drink against the wall. That woman is a viper. Des, I told you in '85, she liked the shine of the diamond more than the man holding it. But you did not listen. Why did you leave? Why didn't you put that little weasel Brad through the drywall? Because that is what they wanted, I said, leaning back against the headboard, listening to the sirens wailing in the distance. Brad had his phone out. Marcus, he was recording. He wanted the angry black man narrative. He wanted me to swing so he could get a restraining order and keep me away from the property legal and clean. I did not give him the satisfaction. You are too calm, Des. Marcus growled. If it were me, the police would already be there. I am not calm, Marcus. I am focusing. I closed my eyes and pictured the property. Not the house as it stands now with its granite countertops and smart home systems, but the land as it was in 1980. Remember when I bought that lot? Marcus? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. Yeah, everyone said you were crazy, Marcus replied, his tone softening. It was a swamp. Des, literally a dump site for the city, couldn't build a doghouse on it without it sinking. Exactly, I said, opening my eyes and staring at the water stain on the ceiling. I spent 2 years draining that land. I drove every pile myself. I mixed the soil with concrete. I turned a bog into the strongest foundation in Georgia. Brad sees the mansion. Vivian sees the price tag, but they don't see the dirt. They don't know what is buried in the paperwork from the original purchase. What are you? Getting it, Des, Marcus asked the lawyer in him waking up. I need you to find the original deed, not the house title, the land deed, the one from the county archives before the rezoning in '98. I set a plan forming in my mind, sharp and clear like a blueprint. I will dig it up first thing in the morning, Marcus promised. But Des, how are you going to eat? How are you going to live? I have got a stash in the truck inside the spare tire. Well, I said, cash. I kept for emergencies back when I was contracting old habits. Die hard. It will last me a few weeks. Get some sleep, old friend, Marcus said gently. We go to war at sunrise. I hung up and set the phone down. The buzzing of the neon sign seemed louder now, mocking me. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. A police cruiser rolled slowly through the parking lot, shining its spotlight on the cars, checking for stolen plates. This was my reality now. One step away from the street, I was about to turn off the lamp when a heavy knock rattled the door. It wasn't the tentative knock of a maid. It was the authoritative pound of someone who gets paid to deliver bad news. I opened the door, a crack, keeping the safety chain on. A young man with acne scars and a bored expression stood there holding a thick manila envelope. Desmond Perkins? He asked, not looking up from his clipboard. That is me. You have been served. He shoved the envelope through the crack and walked away without another word, disappearing into the night. I closed the door and sat on the bed, turning the envelope over in my hands. The return address was a high-powered law firm downtown, the kind that charged $500 just to answer the phone. Inside were the divorce papers, thick and heavy. I began to read, skipping the legal jargon until I got to the section marked Grounds for Dissolution. My eyes scanned the text and my breath caught in my throat. It said, inevitable breakdown of marriage due to respondents, mental instability, financial incompetence, and emotional cruelty. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that frightened me. Emotional cruelty. I was the man who sat up with her when she had the flu, who carried her bags, who listened to her complain about her friends for hours. Financial incompetence. I was the one who turned a toolbox into a $2 million asset. But the next paragraph was the dagger. Petitioner requests full ownership of the marital residence, citing that the respondent has no capacity to maintain the property and poses a safety risk to himself and others. They were painting me as senile, They were painting me as a danger. They wanted to strip me of my mind, not just my assets. Brad's fingerprints were all over this. This was his language, his strategy. Marginalize the old man, make him look crazy. Take the keys. I threw the papers on the floor. They landed next to my muddy work boots. The contrast was perfect. The lies on the paper versus the truth of the mud. Vivian wanted a war. She wanted to erase me. She wanted to rewrite history where she was the victim and I was the villain. She thought I would crumble in this motel room. She thought I would drink myself into oblivion or have a heart attack from the stress. I stood up and walked to the bathroom mirror. The fluorescent light hummed, flickering green and yellow. I looked at my reflection. Tired eyes, gray stubble, deep lines etched by sun and worry. But the eyes were clear. The jaw was set. I am not senile. Vivian, I whispered to the empty room, and I am not incompetent. You want the house. You can have the house, but you forgot to ask who owns the ground it sits on. I turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness save for the red blinking light of the smoke detector. I lay down on the lumpy mattress, fully dressed, ready for the morning. Let them celebrate tonight. Let Brad drink my scotch. Let Vivian sleep in the silk sheets tomorrow. I would meet them in their world of suits and lies, and I would bring a weapon they never saw coming, the truth buried in the mud of 1980. The neon sign buzzed on Star Motel. Star Motel, flickering like a heartbeat, struggling to survive, but I was not struggling. I was waiting. And patience is a weapon that rich people never understand because they are used to getting everything instantly. I could wait. I had waited for the swamp to drain. I could wait for their empire to sink. The law office of Patterson and Finch was located on the 42nd floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of place where the carpet is so thick it swallows the sound of your footsteps, and the air conditioning is set to a temperature that chills you to the bone. I sat in a leather chair that cost more than my first car, my hands resting on my knees, trying to stop them from shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of holding back the rage inside me. Across the mahogany table sat the tribunal of my executioners. My wife Vivian looked younger than her 70 years thanks to the Botox and the professional makeup, but her eyes were old. They were tired and cold, avoiding mine as she studied the manicured nails of her left hand. Next to her was her lawyer, a shark in a three-piece suit named Mr. Sterling, who smiled with too many teeth. But the person who sucked the oxygen out of the room was Brad, my son-in-law. He was not sitting. He was sprawling, leaning back in the chair with his legs spread wide, taking up space as if he owned the building. He checked his gold watch every 30 seconds, tapping his foot with an impatience that said, my life was wasting his precious time. Let us cut to the chase, Sterling said, smoothing out a document on the table. My client wants an amicable separation. Mr. Perkins, we are prepared to offer you a one-time settlement of $10,000 in exchange for you signing over all rights to the marital home and the joint assets immediately. $10,000. I repeated, my voice flat, just loud enough to be heard across the table. The house is appraised at $2 million. The cars are worth $80,000. The savings you stole were over $200,000, and you offer me $10,000. Brad laughed, a sharp barking sound that made Marcus, my lawyer, stiffen beside me. Marcus opened his mouth to object, but Brad cut him off, raising a hand like he was swatting a fly. Look, Pops, let us be real here, Brad said, leaning forward, his elbows digging into the polished wood. You are 72 years old. You are retired. You do not have an income. You cannot afford the property taxes on that estate, let alone the maintenance. Vivian tells me, the roof needs work and the pool pump is failing. You are drowning, Des. We are throwing you a life raft. He pulled a glossy brochure from his briefcase and slid it across the table toward me. It was an artist, rendering of a modern high-rise building glittering with glass and steel. This is the future, Des. Brad said, his eyes gleaming with greed. I have investors lined up. We are not just selling the house, we are scraping the lot. I am going to build the Vivian estate. Luxury condos right where your old workshop stands. 20 units, 3,000 square feet each. This is a multi-million-dollar project and I need clean title to the property to secure the construction loan. I looked at the picture, then at Vivian. She finally met my gaze and I saw the justification in her eyes. She did not see a home. She saw a lottery ticket. Desmond, please, she said. her voice taking on that condescending tone she used when speaking to children or waiters. "Be reasonable. You are old. You do not need that big house anymore. Just you and your memories rattling around in there. It is pathetic, really. Take the money. Get a small apartment. Maybe down in Florida. Let the kids build something. Let them get rich. Why do you have to be so stubborn?" Marcus slammed his hand on the table, making the water pitcher jump. "That is insulting, and you know it." Marcus roared, his face turning red under his gray beard. "Half the marital assets belong to Desmond by law. We will drag this out in court for years before we let you steal his life work." Brad's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer that showed the true ugliness of his soul. "Go ahead, sue us," he hissed. "You have no money for legal fees. Des, your accounts are frozen. Vivian tells me you are staying in a rat-infested motel. How long can you last? A week? A month? I have backing. I have lawyers on retainer. I will bury you in paperwork until you die of old age, and then I will take the house anyway." The room went silent, the threat hanging in the air like toxic smoke. Marcus looked at me, waiting for me to fight, waiting for me to unleash the anger of a man who had been wronged. But I was not looking at Brad. I was looking at the paperwork in front of me, specifically the clause about the transfer of property title. It said clearly, transfer of structure and improvements. It did not mention the land lease. It did not mention the ground underneath. I realized then that Brad's arrogance was his blindfold. He saw the mansion, he saw the profit, but he did not do his due diligence. He did not check the county records from 1980 because he assumed I was just a dumb construction worker who knew nothing about real estate law. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump, letting the years weigh heavily on my posture. I wanted them to see a defeated old man. I wanted them to see a victim. "Give me the pen," I whispered. "Desmond, no," Marcus hissed, grabbing my arm. "Do not do this. We can fight them." "I am tired, Marcus," I said, pulling my arm away gently, looking him in the eye and trying to communicate a silent message. "Trust me. Just trust me." I looked at Vivian, who was trying to hide a smile of triumph. "I will sign," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Perfect acting for a desperate audience. "But I have two conditions." Brad rolled his eyes, leaning back again. "Go on, let us hear it." "First, this divorce happens now, today. I want the decree absolute in 7 days. I want to be severed from this family legally and completely. I do not want any claim on me or my debts after this week. Done," Brad said, waving a hand. "Easy. What else?" "Second, I want my truck, the 95 Ford F-150, and everything inside it. Tools, personal items. Everything. I want it written in the agreement that the truck is my sole property and no one can touch it." Brad burst out laughing. He actually slapped the table with his palm, slamming his hand down in amusement. "The truck," he wheezed. "You want that piece of junk? My God, Des, I was going to pay someone to haul it to the scrapyard. You are doing me a favor. Take it. Take the rust bucket." Vivian let out a sigh of relief. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a checkbook. She scribbled a check for $10,000 and slid it across the table along with the pen. "Here, Desmond," she said, her voice soft now, almost pitying. "Take the truck, take the money, and go find somewhere quiet to live. It is for the best. Really." I picked up the heavy metal pen. It felt cool against my skin. I looked at the document, the words blurring slightly. I was signing away the house I built for my family. I was signing away the garden where my daughter played. I was signing away the master bedroom where I held my wife when her mother died. But I was also signing their death warrant. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name clearly. Desmond Arthur Perkins. I dated it and pushed the papers back toward Brad. Brad snatched them up like a starving dog grabbing a bone. He scanned the signature, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Pleasure doing business with you, Des," he said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Do not worry about the house keys. We will change the locks again anyway, just to be safe." I stood up, ignoring the hand he half-heartedly offered. I picked up the check and folded it carefully, putting it in my pocket. "You got what you wanted, Brad," I said quietly. "You got the house. You got the structure. Good luck with the project." Brad laughed again, clapping me on the shoulder with a fake familiarity that made my skin crawl. "Luck is for losers. Des, I have vision. Enjoy the motel." He walked out of the room, Vivian trailing behind him like a loyal pet. Neither of them looked back. Neither of them saw the look on my face. Marcus sat in his chair, his head in his hands, looking devastated. "Desmond, You just gave away $2 million for a used truck and pocket change. I cannot believe you did that. I walked over to the window, looking down at the city streets below, watching Brad and Vivian exit the building and get into my Mercedes. They looked so happy, so victorious. I turned to Marcus and smiled, a genuine smile. This time I did not give away $2 million, Marcus, I said. I sold them a box of air. I signed over the structure. Marcus, the house, the walls, the roof. But Des, the house is the asset. No, Marcus, I said, walking to the door. The house is a liability without the land it sits on, and I still own the dirt. Stand up, old friend. We have to go to the courthouse to file that deed before they realize what they just bought. Marcus looked at me, confusion clearing from his eyes, replaced by a dawning realization. He stood up, grabbing his briefcase, a grin starting to form on his face. You old fox, he whispered. You absolutely brilliant old fox. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, feeling lighter than I had in days. They wanted to play hardball. Well, they just struck out, and they did not even know the game was over. Marcus was screaming so loud inside the cab of my '95 Ford pickup that I thought the passenger window might shatter. He was red in the face, his tie loosened, and he was looking at me like I had just driven us both off a cliff. $2 million, Desmond, he yelled, hitting the dashboard with his fist. $2 million, and you gave it away for a $10,000 check and a rusted truck. Are you out of your mind? Did you have a stroke in that office? Because I can turn this car around and drive you to the emergency room right now. I did not answer him. I just kept my eyes on the road-shifting gears with the ease of muscle memory. The engine hummed a low, steady growl that comforted me. It was the sound of something real, something mechanical, something that obeyed the laws of physics, unlike the world of lawyers and lies we had just left. You are not listening to me, Marcus continued, his voice cracking with frustration. Brad is going to bulldoze your life. He is going to knock down the house you built for Vivian and build condos, and he is going to laugh all the way to the bank while you rot in that motel room. I turned the radio knob, finding a station playing slow Delta blues. The mournful sound of a harmonica filled the cab, cutting through Marcus's panic. I am hungry, Marcus, I said, calm as a mill pond. Let us go. Get some ribs. Marcus stared at me, his mouth hanging open. Ribs, he sputtered. You want ribs? You just lost your entire fortune, and you want barbecue. I ignored him and pulled the truck into the gravel lot of Big Daddy's smokehouse. It was a shack on the edge of town, the kind of place Brad would never set foot in because the floor was covered in sawdust and the air smelled of hickory smoke and pork fat, the kind of place where men came to eat with their hands and not worry about stains on their silk shirts. We walked inside and I waved to the owner, a large man named Earl who had been smoking meat since before I started laying bricks. We sat at a booth in the back, the vinyl seat taped up with duct tape. Marcus sat down heavily, looking defeated. He ordered a whiskey. Neat. I ordered a rack of ribs and an iced tea. Desmond. Look at me, Marcus said, his voice lower now, pleading. I can file an appeal. I can claim you were under duress. We can try to void the agreement before the judge stamps it tomorrow. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for the check Vivian gave me, but for the worn leather satchel I always carried. Inside was a single file folder yellowed with age, the edges fraying. It looked like trash, but to me it looked like a loaded gun. I slid the folder across the sticky table toward him. Open it, I said. Marcus looked at the folder suspiciously. What is this? Just open it. Marcus read the date on the first page. He sighed, putting on his reading glasses, and flipped the cover open. 1998, he read aloud. Okay, so what? This is just old business paperwork. Do you remember? 98, Marcus, I asked, picking up my iced tea. Do you remember what happened to the market? Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, the construction bubble burst. Interest rates went up. A lot of good men went under. I almost went under too, I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a low rumble. I had leveraged everything to expand the business. I had creditors calling the house day and night. Vivian was scared she was threatening to leave me back then too, saying I was going to leave her homeless. I took a sip of tea, letting the memory wash over me. The sleepless nights, the fear of losing it all. I had to protect the asset, Marcus. I had to make sure that no matter what happened to the business, no matter who came after me for debts, they could never take the roof over my family's head. So I did something unconventional, something an old structural engineer taught me. Marcus looked up from the papers, his eyes narrowing. What did you do? I legally separated the property, I said, pointing a calloused finger at the document. I created two separate entities. One entity owns the physical structure, the house, the garage, the pool. The other entity owns the land, the dirt, the grass, the driveway. Marcus frowned, scanning the legal jargon. Yeah, okay, ground leases are common in commercial real estate, but for a residential home. It is rare, I admitted, but it is legal. I transferred the ownership of the land into a trust that I control completely solely, and then I had the entity that owns the house sign a 99-year lease for the use of the land. Okay, Marcus said, shrugging. So what, Brad and Vivian now own the house, which means they assume the lease, they just have to pay you rent for the land. Big deal, Desmond. That is maybe a few $100 a month. That is not a victory. Keep reading, Marcus. I said, a small smile touching the corners of my lips. Turn to page 4, clause 7, subsection B. Marcus flipped the pages, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs of legal text. The waitress arrived with our ribs, placing a steaming pile of meat between us. But Marcus did not even look at the food. He found the clause, and I watched his eyes stop moving. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched his jaw slowly drop. Read it out loud, I said. Marcus swallowed hard and began to read, his voice trembling slightly. The lease for the ground rights is granted solely to the original structure owner, Desmond and Vivian Perkins, as a married couple, living in the primary residence, in the event that the ownership of the structure changes hands, or in the event that the marriage of the primary leaseholders is dissolved by divorce or death, or in the event that the structure is used for any purpose other than a single-family private residence, this ground lease shall automatically and immediately terminate. He stopped reading and looked up at me, his face pale. Keep reading, I urged. The last sentence is the kicker. Marcus looked back down and read the final line. Upon termination of the lease, the owner of the structure shall have 48 hours to remove said structure from the land. Failing to do so will result in the structure becoming the property of the land owner or being classified as abandoned debris, to be removed at the structure owner's expense. Silence fell over the table, heavy and thick. The blues music seemed to fade away. Marcus looked at me, then looked at the paper, then looked at me again. My God, Desmond, he whispered. I picked up a rib, the meat falling off the bone. Brad wants to build condos, I said, taking a bite. He wants to scrape the lot. Well, he can't scrape the lot because he does not own it. He owns a pile of bricks and wood sitting on my dirt, and because Vivian divorced me, the lease is void because he plans to develop it. The lease is void. Marcus started to laugh. It started as a chuckle low in his throat and then built into a full belly laugh that made the other patrons turn and look. He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. You old son of a gun, Marcus choked out, wiping tears from his eyes. You let them sign the papers. You let them think they won the lottery, but they just bought a house that is technically trespassing on your land. They have 48 hours, I said, wiping barbecue sauce from my lip. After the judge stamps those divorce papers tomorrow, the clock starts ticking. But they don't know, Marcus said, his eyes wide with glee. No, they don't. I said I tried to tell them. Didn't I? I told Brad to watch the foundation. I told him old houses shift when the weight changes. He didn't listen. He was too busy measuring the curtains. Marcus shook his head, looking at the document with reverence. This is the nastiest, most beautiful legal trap I have ever seen. Desmond. They are going to lose their minds. Brad has probably already leveraged the house for his loan. He has. I confirmed he borrowed $500,000 against the house to start his project, but the bank accepted the house as collateral, assuming the land came with it. When the bank finds out the house has no right to be on the land, the loan will default instantly. Marcus raised his glass of whiskey. To the dirt, he said, grinning like a wolf. To the dirt, I replied, clinking my glass of tea against his. We ate in silence for a while, savoring the victory that was yet to come. I imagined Brad celebrating right now, popping champagne, telling his friends how he outsmarted the old man. I imagined Vivian planning her new wardrobe, spending money she did not have. They had kicked a dog thinking it was old and toothless. They forgot that an old dog knows exactly where the jugular is, and he does not bark before he bites. Finish your ribs, Marcus, I said, standing up and throwing a $20 bill on the table. We have an early morning. We need to be at the county recorder's office when they open. I want to make sure that lease termination is filed the second the divorce is final. Marcus stood up, grabbing the yellowed file as if it were the Holy Grail. I would not miss this for the world. Des, he said. We walked out into the cool night air, the neon sign of Big Daddy's buzzing behind us. I looked up at the moon hanging low and heavy over Atlanta. Enjoy the house tonight. Vivian, I thought, enjoy the master bedroom. Enjoy the view, because tomorrow you are going to find out that a castle is just a pile of rocks. If you don't own the mountain it stands on. I parked my truck 3 blocks away under the shadow of an old oak tree that had escaped the developer's chainsaws, sitting in the dark cab with the windows rolled down. I could smell it, the thick, sweet scent of hickory smoke and roasting meat drifting on the evening breeze. It was the smell of a celebration, the smell of victory, and it was coming from my backyard. I turned off the ignition and sat there in the silence of the cab holding a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. My hand brushed against the steering wheel, the leather cracked and worn just like my patience. I shouldn't have come. Marcus told me not to come, he said. Watching them would only twist the knife deeper, but I needed to see it. I needed to witness the height of their arrogance so I could fully appreciate the depth of their fall. I stepped out of the truck, pulling my cap low over my eyes, and walked through the wooded path that ran behind the properties in this neighborhood. I knew this path because I cleared it myself 40 years ago for my daughter Keisha, so she could walk to school without crossing the main road. Now I was using it to spy on the life that used to be mine. Through the gaps in the hedges I saw them. The backyard was lit up with strings of Edison bulbs swinging gently in the humid Atlanta air. There were white linen tablecloths covering the picnic tables I built from reclaimed timber. There were waiters in black vests carrying trays of champagne, and there was music, a soft jazz playlist that Vivian always said was sophisticated, but I always found soulless. There must have been 50 people there, the sharks in suits, the plastic wives, the people who never called when I was sick, but were the first to show up for free liquor, and standing in the center of it all wearing a white linen suit that looked ridiculous. Next to a barbecue pit was Brad. He was holding a pair of tongs in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other, laughing at something a banker was saying. I watched him flip a steak on the grill, a grill I had bricked by hand, mixing the mortar just right so it would withstand the heat for 100 years. Seeing him use it felt like watching a thief drive my car. I moved closer. Crouching behind the hydrangeas Vivian had planted last spring, she was sitting on the patio furniture, holding court. She looked radiant. I had to admit that the relief of getting rid of me seemed to have taken 10 years off her face. She was laughing, throwing her head back, a sound I hadn't heard in a decade. She was telling a story, and I strained my ears to hear. "Oh, Desmond is fine," she was saying, waving a dismissive hand. "He is staying at some place near the highway. He needs the quiet. You know how he gets with crowds. Poor thing. His mind just isn't what it used to be. We did him a kindness, really, letting him retire without the burden of this big place. A kindness." My grip on the fence post tightened until a splinter dug into my palm. They were rewriting my history while the ink on the divorce papers was barely dry. They were turning me into a charity case, a senile old man who needed to be put out to pasture. Then Brad clinked his spoon against his glass, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter. "Quiet. Everyone, quiet, please," he shouted, his face flushed with alcohol and pride. The guests fell silent, turning toward him with expectant smiles. "I want to propose a toast," Brad said, raising his glass to the sky. "First to my beautiful mother-in-law Vivian for having the courage to choose herself after all these years of sacrifice." There was a round of polite applause. Vivian beamed, blowing a kiss to the crowd. And second, Brad continued, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who thinks he is untouchable to the future. "Look around you. Everyone take a good look at this garden, because in 6 months this will all be gone." A murmur of confusion went through the crowd. "Gone?" someone asked. "Gone and replaced by something better," Brad announced, spreading his arms wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Vivian Estate, a 20-unit luxury condominium complex that will set a new standard for living in this city. No more old maintenance. Heavy houses, just sleek, modern, efficient living." He paused for dramatic effect, and I felt a cold smile touch my lips. He had no idea, absolutely no idea, and I am proud to announce, Brad shouted, that as of this afternoon we have secured the funding to break ground thanks to the equity in this property. I just signed a loan for $500,000 to cover the initial architectural and demolition costs. The bank saw the value of this location, and they wrote the check immediately. I froze in the bushes. $500,000 he had leveraged the house he had used. The house is collateral for a massive loan, assuming he owned the land it sat on. My mind raced, doing the math faster than any calculator. The divorce papers were signed. The judge would stamp them tomorrow morning. The moment that stamp hit the paper, the ground lease would terminate. The moment the lease terminated, the house became a trespassing structure on my land, which meant the house, the bank's collateral, was legally worthless. Brad had just committed bank fraud. He didn't mean to. He didn't know he was doing it, but ignorance of the law is not a defense, especially when you are borrowing $500,000 of other people's money. He had just tied a concrete block around his ankles and jumped into the ocean. To the Vivian estate, the crowd roared, raising their glasses. To the dirt, I whispered into the darkness. I looked at Keisha, my daughter, standing near the back door. She wasn't drinking, she wasn't smiling, she looked pale, almost sick. She was looking at the house, looking at her husband, and I wondered if deep down she knew, if she sensed the rot beneath the floorboards. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her to run, to get away from him before the walls came down. But I stayed silent. She had made her choice. She had signed the papers too. Suddenly the wind picked up. The leaves of the oak trees turned over, showing their pale undersides. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the ground beneath my boots. Atlanta storms don't give you a warning. They just hit, drop by drop. At first, then a deluge, a fat drop of rain hit Brad's nose. He looked up annoyed, as if the sky had dared to interrupt his speech. Another drop landed in his scotch, then another. "It is just a sprinkle, folks," Brad yelled. "Don't worry, the party goes on." But the sky opened up. A curtain of water descended, turning the garden into a swamp. In seconds, the ladies screamed, covering their hair with their purses. The men ran for cover, slipping on the wet grass. "Get inside!" Brad shouted, waving his tongs wildly. Everyone into the house. I watched them scramble like ants when the hill is kicked over. They ran for the back door, pushing and shoving, dragging mud onto Vivian's pristine white carpets. The paper lanterns sogged and fell. The white tablecloths were soaked, clinging to the tables like ghosts. Brad was the last one in. He tried to cover the grill, but the fire hissed and died under the downpour. He cursed, kicking the brickwork before running toward the house. He slammed the sliding glass door shut, locking out the storm inside. The lights were warm and golden. I could see them laughing, towel drying their hair, safe inside their fortress. I stood up in the rain, letting the water soak through my shirt, cooling the anger in my skin. I looked at the roof of the house, specifically at the valley where the two main gables met. Brad didn't know about the valley. Flashing, I had installed temporary flashing there 3 years ago, intending to replace it with copper. This summer, it was good for light rain, but a storm like this, a storm with driving wind and heavy downpour, that temporary flashing wasn't going to hold. I watched the window of the master bedroom, Vivian's room. I knew exactly where the water would come in, right above the antique armoire she loved so much, right where she kept her expensive collection of silk scarves. The water was hitting the roof hard now, finding the path of least resistance, seeping under the shingles, finding the gap in the flashing, dripping onto the insulation, soaking through the drywall. It starts as a stain, I thought, a small yellow circle on the ceiling, then the paint bubbles, then the drip, drip, drip. I turned away from the house, the sound of the party replaced by the sound of the rain hitting the leaves. I walked back to my truck, my boots squelching in the mud that I owned. "Enjoy the party, Brad," I said to the wind. "Enjoy the champagne and the loan and the big dreams, because tonight the sky is crying for you, and tomorrow the law is coming for you." I climbed into my truck and started the engine. The wipers slashed back and forth, clearing the view not of the house but of the road ahead. I checked my phone. A text from Marcus read, "Everything is ready for 8 a.m. filing. Get some sleep." I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to listen to the rain. I was going to listen to the sound of my land washing away their footprints. As I drove away, I imagined the first drop of water hitting Vivian's pillow. I imagined the damp spot growing on the ceiling above Brad's head while he slept. They wanted the house. They got the house, but they forgot that a house needs a roof and a roof needs a builder, and the builder just left the building. The morning sun hit the peeling paint of the Star Motel with a harsh brightness that made my eyes ache. I sat on the edge of the bed holding a cup of lukewarm coffee from the lobby, listening to the sound of trucks rumbling down the interstate nearby. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. Normally I would be at the hardware store or working on a project in the garage, but today I was waiting. I was waiting for a very specific sound, and at 10:15 exactly it came. My phone vibrated against the cheap laminate of the nightstand, buzzing like an angry hornet. I looked at the screen and saw the name flashes up. Brad's son-in-law. I didn't smile. Not yet smiling would be premature. I let it ring 3 times, 4 times, letting his panic build, letting him sweat. I picked up on the 5th ring, keeping my voice slow and heavy, the voice of a man who had given up. "Hello, Desmond." Brad's voice didn't just sound angry, it sounded strangled, like someone had tightened a tie around his neck. Way too tight I could hear the background noise of a busy office, probably the bank or his real estate firm, and I could hear the heavy breathing of a man who was trying not to scream. "What did you do, old man?" Brad hissed. I took a sip of coffee, intentionally making a slurping sound, knowing it would grate on his nerves. "Who is this?" I asked, feigning confusion. "Don't play games with me, Desmond," Brad shouted, and I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "I am at the bank. I am sitting here with the loan officer and the vice president. We were supposed to close on the construction loan 10 minutes ago. And do you know what they told me?" I stayed silent, counting the cracks in the ceiling. "They told me there is a cloud on the title." Brad spit the words out. "They said the collateral is invalid. They said the structure doesn't have a securing deed for the land it sits on. What kind of game are you playing?" I leaned back against the headboard, letting my voice tremble just a little bit, just enough to sell the performance. "Brad, I don't understand," I said, sounding frail. "I signed the papers you gave me in the office, remember? I signed everything you said I had to sign so I could get my truck back." "You signed the divorce decree," Brad yelled, ignoring my point. "You signed over the house, but the bank is saying there is a ground lease, a 99-year ground lease from 1980 that just terminated automatically because of the divorce. Why didn't you tell me about the ground lease, Desmond?" I paused, letting the silence stretch out, making him wait. "Ground lease," I repeated slowly, as if testing the word on my tongue. "Oh, you mean the paper about the dirt?" "Yes, the paper about the dirt. You senile old fool." Brad was losing it completely. Now I could hear papers rustling frantically in the background. "Listen to me very carefully. Desmond, you need to come down here right now and sign a waiver. You need to sign a deed of transfer for the land immediately." "I cannot do that, Brad," I said simply. "What do you mean you cannot do that? You are going to get in your truck and you are going to drive to First National Bank right now, or so help me. God, I will. I don't have any gas." "Brad," I interrupted him, my voice whining slightly, "and I spent the $10,000 you gave me on the hotel bill and some debts I owed. I am just an old man, Brad. I don't understand all these fancy legal terms. You said the house was yours. I gave you the house. I thought you were the smart one, Brad. I thought you knew everything about real estate." There was a silence on the other end, a silence so profound I could almost hear the gears in his brain grinding to a halt. He was realizing that his arrogance had blinded him. He had been so busy looking at the mansion, he never looked at the ground. "I am not playing." "Desmond," Brad said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, "if you don't sign that land over to me, the loan falls through. If the loan falls through, I lose the deposit I put down on the project, and if I lose the deposit, I am ruined. Do you understand? I leverage everything on this." "That sounds like a young man problem," I said, keeping my tone innocent. "I am just trying to figure out how to work the remote control for this TV, Desmond." "Listen to me, Brad," said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I am coming to you. Where are you? Are you at that dump on the highway?" "I am here," I said. "I am just watching the news." "Stay there," Brad ordered. "Don't you move an inch. I am coming over with the notary, and you are going to sign that paper or I will drag you to court for fraud." "You can come if you want, Brad," I said, "but I am feeling very tired. I might take a nap." I hung up the phone and finally allowed myself to smile. It was a small, cold smile, the kind a soldier gives before the ambush springs. I knew exactly what had happened. The bank's title company had run a last-minute check this morning just before releasing the funds. They saw the divorce filing, which went public at 9 a.m., and their system flagged the ground lease termination clause. Instantly, banks don't lend money on houses that are technically trespassing. They froze the funds, and Brad was left standing at the altar with no ring. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. I saw my reflection in the glass, an old black man in a flannel shirt looking worn out and harmless. That was my armor. That was my camouflage. Brad thought I was incompetent. He thought I was a relic. He didn't realize that while he was learning how to tie a Windsor knot, I was learning how to read contracts so tight they could choke a man. I walked over to the door and unlocked the deadbolt, then I unlocked the handle lock. I wanted it to be easy for him. I wanted him to storm in here thinking he was the alpha, thinking he could bully me into submission. I went back to the bed and sat down, picking up a newspaper from yesterday. I waited 10 minutes, passed, then 20. Then I heard it, the roar of the high-performance engine peeling into the parking lot. Brad drove a Porsche Cayenne, a car that cost more than my first house. I heard the tires screech on the asphalt. I heard a car door slam with enough force to dent the metal. Then came the footsteps, heavy and fast, pounding on the concrete walkway approaching room 114. He didn't knock. He didn't ask to come in. The door flew open, hitting the wall with a crash that shook the room. Brad stood in the doorway, his face purple with rage. His expensive suit rumpled, his hair wild. He looked like a man who had run through a hurricane to get here. Behind him stood a terrified-looking woman holding a notary stamp, clutching her purse to her chest. "Sign it!" Brad screamed, marching into the room and slapping a fresh document onto the wobbly table sign. "It now, you miserable old bastard." I looked up from my newspaper, slowly adjusting my glasses. I looked at him, then at the woman, then back at him. "Hello, Brad," I said, my voice calm, steady, and completely sane. "I see you found the place." "Okay, sign it," Brad roared, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a pen. He uncapped it and threw it at me. It bounced off my chest and landed on the floor. I looked at the pen, then I looked at Brad. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I dropped the mask. I stood up slowly, rising to my full height of 6'2", my back straightening, the years of stooping falling away. I wasn't the tired old man anymore. I was the foreman who ran crews of 50 tough men. I was the father who protected his family. I was the owner of the dirt he was standing on. "I am not signing anything, Brad," I said, my voice deep and resonating in the small room. Brad blinked, taken back by the sudden change in my demeanor. "What did you say?" I said. "I am not signing," I repeated, taking a step toward him, causing him to instinctively step back. "You wanted the house, Brad. You took the house, you kicked me out, you changed the locks, you threw my life into garbage bags. Well, congratulations, you own the house, every brick, every board, every nail, but you forgot to ask permission from the landlord." "I am the landlord," Brad shouted. "I own the title." "You own the structure," I corrected him, my voice hard as steel. "I own the land, and according to the lease which terminated the moment the judge stamped those papers at 9 a.m., you have exactly 46 hours left to remove your structure from my property." Brad's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "What are you talking about?" "Remove the structure. It is a mansion." "Desmond, you can't move a mansion." "That sounds like a you problem," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "If it is not off my land by Sunday noon, I will consider it abandoned property and I will bulldoze it myself." "You are crazy, Brad," whispered, the color draining from his face. "You are actually crazy." "No, Brad," I said, leaning in close so he could smell the coffee on my breath. "I am not crazy. I am just a man who reads the fine print. Now, get out of my motel room before I call the police and tell them you are harassing a senior citizen." Brad stared at me, his hands shaking. He looked at the document on the table, then at me, then at the door. He realized in that moment that the power had shifted. He had the suit and the car and the youth, but I had the lever and I was about to pull it. He grabbed the document off the table, crumpling it in his fist. "This isn't over," he spat, retreating toward the door. "I will sue you. I will drag you through every court in Georgia." "Bring it on," I said. "I have nothing but time." He turned and stormed out, the notary scrambling after him, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I watched them go, watched the Porsche peel out of the parking lot, leaving black tire marks on the pavement. I closed the door and locked it again. Then I sat back down on the bed and picked up my phone. I dialed Marcus. "He was here," I said. "Did he sign the waiver?" Marcus asked, his voice full of excitement. "No," I said. "I told him to move his house." Marcus laughed above. Ooh-ee. Long, loud laugh that made me smile. "Get ready, Des," Marcus said. "The storm is just starting." I hung up and looked around the motel room. It was still ugly. It still smelled like smoke. but for the first time since I arrived, it felt like a command center. The first battle was won, but the war was far from over. Brad was desperate, and desperate men do dangerous things. I needed to be ready for the next wave because he wasn't going to give up $500,000 without a fight. He was going to come back, and next time he wouldn't bring a notary, he would bring fire. The door to room 114 didn't just open, it exploded inward, hitting the wall with a violence that made the cheap landscape painting above the bed. Crooked Brad stood in the frame, breathing hard, his chest heaving beneath his soaked designer shirt. Sweat was dripping from his forehead, running down into his eyes, stinging them with the salt of his own panic. He looked like a man who had run a marathon through a swamp, only to find out the finish line had been moved. He didn't say hello, he didn't apologize for the intrusion. He marched into the room, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply on the dirty linoleum floor, and threw a document at me. It wasn't a handoff, it was a projectile. The papers fluttered apart midair, hitting my chest before scattering onto the stained bedspread like dead leaves. "Sign it," Brad barked, his voice hoarse and cracking. "Sign it right now, you old fool, and I will give you $5,000 cash today." I sat on the edge of the bed, looking down at the papers without moving a muscle inside. I was a coiled spring ready to snap, but on the outside I was Desmond, the 72-year-old retiree whose hands shook and whose mind wandered. I slumped, my shoulders curving my spine, making myself look smaller, frailer. I looked up at him, blinking slowly behind my glasses, keeping my mouth slightly open. "What is this, Brad?" I asked, my voice trembling, a perfect octave of confusion. I thought we were done. I thought you took the house. We are not done until I say we are done, Brad screamed, kicking the leg of the bedside table, making the lamp wobble. "I need you to sign this. Quitclaim deed, transferring the land rights to me and Vivian immediately. Do you hear me? Immediately." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills wrapped in a rubber band. He tossed it onto the bed next to my thigh. "There is $5,000. Desmond, count it. It is more money than you have seen in years. Take it, sign the paper, and go buy yourself some new work boots, or whatever it is. You people buy when you get a handout. You people." The words hung in the air, stagnant and foul. I knew what he meant. He didn't mean construction workers. He didn't mean retirees. He meant exactly what his father had meant 40 years ago when he told me not to walk on his sidewalk. Brad had always hidden his prejudice behind a smile and a handshake, but now, stripped of his power, the ugly truth was leaking out like sewage from a broken pipe. I reached for the papers, my hand shaking violently. I made sure the tremor looked uncontrollable. I fumbled with the pages, mixing them up, acting like the simple act of holding paper was a Herculean task. "I don't have a pen, Brad," I whispered, looking around the room helplessly. Brad let out a groan of frustration, grabbing a gold Mont Blanc pen from his jacket pocket and thrusting it at me. "Here, use this, just sign on the dotted line right there next to the X." I took the pen, holding it awkwardly like a child learning to write. I leaned over the nightstand where my cup of coffee was sitting cold and black. I brought the paper close to my face, squinting as if I couldn't read the print. "It is so small, Brad," I mumbled. "I cannot see the letters. Where are my reading glasses?" "Just sign it, damn it," Brad yelled, stepping closer, looming over me, his shadow falling across the bed. "You don't need to read it. Just put your name down." I reached for my coffee cup with my left hand, while holding the pen in my right, and then I let it happen. I let my hand spasm just enough, just at the right angle. The cup tipped over the dark liquid, splashing across the nightstand, soaking into the crisp white paper of the deed, dripping onto the floor and splashing onto the polished toe of Brad's $3,000 shoe. Brad jumped back, letting out a sound that was half scream, half sob. "You stupid old man, look what you did. Look at my shoe. Look at the contract." "I am sorry, Brad," I stammered, grabbing a napkin and trying to dab at the soaked paper, only making it worse, tearing the wet pulp. I am so clumsy these days, my hands. They just don't listen to me anymore. Brad snatched the soggy paper from my hand, tearing it in half in his anger. He threw the wet mess onto the floor and glared at me, his eyes bulging with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. "You are useless." He spat the venom in his voice, poisoning the air. "Absolutely useless. You are a waste of space, Desmond. Do you know that? Desmond, do you?" Vivian was right. We should have put you in a home years ago. You are just a burden dragging everyone down with your incompetence. Look at you sitting in a filth hole, shaking like a leaf. You are pathetic. He took a step closer, invading my personal space, his finger pointing in my face. I am going to print another copy, he hissed, and I am going to come back here, and you are going to sign it without spilling anything. Do you understand me? Because if you don't, I will make sure you never see another dime of your pension. I will bury you, Desmond. I will crush you like the bug you are. He stopped breathing heavily, waiting for me to cower, waiting for me to apologize again. But I didn't apologize. I stopped shaking. I sat up straight, the curve in my spine disappearing as I engaged the muscles of my back, muscles built by lifting beams and pouring concrete. I took off my glasses and folded them slowly, placing them on the dry side of the nightstand. I looked up at him, and for the first time I let him see me, not the character I was playing, but the man I was. The man who had survived a war. The man who had built a business from nothing. The man who had raised a family in a world that wanted to keep him down. The silence in the room changed. It shifted from the silence of a victim to the silence of a predator. Brad sensed it. He took a half step back, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What?" he asked, his voice losing some of its steam. I reached out and picked up the roll of money he had thrown on the bed. I weighed it in my hand, feeling the texture of the cash. Then I tossed it back at him. It hit him in the chest and fell to the floor, landing in the puddle of coffee. "I don't want your money, Brad," I said, my voice low, deep, and steady, the tremor completely gone. Brad stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, and I am not clumsy. I continued standing up slowly. I towered over him. Now he was a tall man, but in that moment I was a mountain. I spilled that coffee because I wanted to. I spilled it because that paper is trash and trash belongs on the floor. "Desmond, what are you doing?" Brad whispered, fear creeping into his eyes. "I am doing what I should have done the day you walked into my house with your arrogance and your fake smile," I said, stepping closer, forcing him to retreat toward the door. "You called me useless, Brad. You called me a burden. You think because I am 72 and black and wear work boots that I am stupid. You think because you wear a suit and talk fast that you are smart. Well, let me teach you a lesson about real estate, son." I pointed a finger at his chest hard enough to bruise. "You bought a house, Brad, but you didn't buy the foundation. You tried to steal my legacy, and now you are standing on quicksand." "I am not signing that paper," I said, my voice rising, filling the small room, pushing against the walls. "Not for $5,000, not for $5 million, because I am not selling. You have 46 hours left, Brad." Tick-tock. Brad looked at me, looked at the coffee. Stained money on the floor, looked at the ruined contract. He realized then that the old man he had come to bully didn't exist. Standing in front of him was the general of an army he hadn't prepared to fight. He turned and fled. He didn't march out. This time, he scrambled, fumbling with the doorknob, tearing the door open and running into the parking lot like the devil himself was snapping at his heels. I walked to the door and watched him go, watched him jump into his Porsche and speed away, almost hitting a dumpster on his way out. I closed the door gently and locked it. I walked back to the nightstand, picked up the napkin and wiped the coffee ring from the wood. I wasn't shaking anymore. My hands were steady as rocks. I picked up my phone and saw a text from Keisha asking if I was okay. I didn't reply. Not yet. She had chosen her side. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, washing away the act, washing away the frailty. I looked in the mirror and saw the eyes of a man who was just getting started. "Come back with all the paper you want, Brad," I whispered to my reflection. "Bring the lawyers, bring the police, bring the whole damn world. I am Desmond Perkins and I am not moving." 30 days is a long time when you are waiting for a wound to heal, but it passes in the blink of an eye when you are sitting on a throne built of lies waiting for the executioner to pull the lever. The law in Georgia is very specific about final decrees. There is a grace period, a window of time where appeals can be filed, where cooler heads can prevail, where mistakes can be corrected. I gave them that time. I sat in my motel room counting the days on the calendar one by one, waiting for the sun to set on the 30th day. I did not call them. I did not answer the frantic texts from Keisha. I did not respond to the threatening voicemails from Brad's lawyer. I just waited, because silence is the loudest noise you can make when your enemy is listening for a footstep. On the morning of the 31st of the show day, I woke up before the alarm. The sky was a bruised purple turning into a steel gray dawn. I shaved carefully, put on my best work shirt, the one with the reinforced elbows, and laced up my boots. Tight today was not a day for suits. Today was a day for hard hats and heavy machinery. I drove to the equipment rental yard where my old friend Sal was waiting for me. Sal and I had moved Earth together since the 80s. He didn't ask questions when I told him what I needed. He just chewed on his cigar and pointed to the flatbed truck idling in the yard. Sitting on the back of that truck was a Komatsu bulldozer, a beautiful, terrifying beast of yellow steel weighing 40,000 pounds with a blade that could push a mountain aside. I climbed into the cab of the flatbed leading the way in my Ford pickup. We drove through the sleeping city, heading north toward the gated community where my ex-wife and her parasite of a son-in-law were sleeping in my bed. The security guard at the gate tried to stop us. He stepped out of his booth, holding up a hand, his eyes widening as he saw the bulldozer. I rolled down my window, holding out the deed to the land, the paper that proved I owned the dirt under his booth and the road he was standing on. "Open the gate, son," I said, my voice low and rumbling like the diesel engine behind me. "I am doing landscaping work on my property." He looked at the deed. He looked at the bulldozer, and he looked at me. He was a smart kid. He pressed the button, and the iron gate swung open, admitting the Trojan horse into the fortress. We drove slowly down the tree-lined street, the rumble of the heavy truck shaking the windows of the colonial mansions. Neighbors peeked out from behind their silk curtains, wondering what kind of construction crew started work at 7 on a Saturday morning. I didn't care about the neighbors anymore. I didn't care about the homeowners association rules. I was the lord of the manor, returning to claim his kingdom. I pulled up to the curb in front of the house, my house. It looked peaceful. The sprinklers were hissing rhythmically, watering the grass. I paid for the birds were singing in the oak trees I planted. But the peace was a lie. Inside that house were two people who had stripped me of everything except the one thing that mattered. I signaled Sal to unload the dozer. The sound of the hydraulic ramp lowering was like a drawbridge coming down. Then the engine of the bulldozer roared to life, a deep guttural sound that shattered the morning quiet. Clank, clank, clank went the metal tracks as Sal drove the machine off the truck and positioned it right on the edge of the driveway, the massive blade resting just inches from the brick pillar of the gate. I walked up to the front gate carrying a staple gun and a large sheet of laminated paper. I didn't ring the doorbell. I didn't knock. I placed the paper against the wood of the front gate and squeezed the trigger of the staple gun. Thwack, 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 thwack. The sound echoed like gunshots in the morning air. I stepped back to admire my work. The sign was bright orange, impossible to miss, and printed in bold black letters, "Notice of Land Reclamation." To the owners of the unauthorized structure located on this parcel, you are hereby notified that your ground lease has expired and been terminated effective immediately under the terms of the original 1980 agreement. The landowner exercises his right to reclaim the surface area of the lot. You have 48 hours to remove all personal property and the physical structure consisting of one 2-story dwelling from the premises. Failure to remove the structure will result in it being classified as construction debris, and it will be demolished and removed at the landowner's discretion and at the structure owner's expense. Signed, Desmond Perkins, landowner. I stood there, arms crossed, waiting. I knew the sound of the staple gun and the idling bulldozer would wake them up. Sure enough, the front door yanked open. Brad stumbled out, wearing nothing but silk boxer shorts and a t-shirt. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were puffy with sleep. He looked confusingly at the giant yellow machine parked on his lawn. Then he saw me. "What the hell is going on?" he screamed, running down the driveway, his bare feet slapping against the pavement. "Get that thing off my driveway! Desmond, have you lost your mind?" I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just pointed to the sign. "Read it, Brad," I said. Brad ripped the sign off the gate, tearing the paper in his haste. He scanned it, his eyes moving back and forth frantically, his face turning from pale to a deep, blotchy red. "Reclamation," he sputtered. "Remove the structure. What does this mean, you crazy old bat? You can't tell me to move a house I can, and I just did," I replied, my voice calm, deadly, calm. "You are trespassing. Brad, your house is squatting on my land. I gave you a month to negotiate. I gave you a chance to be a man, but you wanted to play hardball. So here we are. Vivian appeared in the doorway, wrapping a robe around her thin frame. She looked older without her makeup, her face drawn and fearful. She saw the bulldozer and let out a small shriek, covering her mouth with her hand. "Desmond," she called out, her voice trembling. "What are you doing? Please stop this." I looked at her, the woman I had loved for 40 years, the woman who had looked me in the eye and told me I was useless. "Hello, Vivian," I said, tipping the brim of my cap. "I am just doing some gardening. I decided I want to plant a vegetable patch right where your living room is." "You can't do this," Brad yelled, crushing the paper in his fist. "I am calling the police." "Call them," I challenged. "I already spoke to the sheriff this morning. He knows exactly what this is. This is a civil dispute regarding property lines, and I have the deed. You have a house, Brad, but you have nowhere to put it." Sal revved the engine of the bulldozer, a cloud of black smoke puffing into the air. The metal blade lifted a few inches and dropped with a heavy clang, shaking the ground under Brad's feet. "You have 48 hours, I said, checking my watch. "Starting now, if that house is still here on Monday morning, I am going to push it into the creek." Brad looked at the machine, then at me, his eyes wild with panic and rage. He realized that his lawyer hadn't been able to fix this. He realized that the bank had pulled his funding. He realized that he was standing in his underwear in front of the whole neighborhood, about to lose everything. "You are bluffing," he screamed, spitting as he spoke. "You wouldn't dare destroy this house. It is worth millions. It is worth zero," I said, cold as ice. "It is just wood and brick. Brad, it is just a pile of materials sitting in my way, and I have a lot of work to do." Vivian walked down the steps, her legs shaking. She looked at the sign in Brad's hand, then looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "Desmond, please," she whispered. "Don't do this. We can talk. We can work something out." "It is too late for talking, Vivian," I said, turning my back on her. 30 days too late. That was the breaking point. The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. She swayed her face, losing all color, her eyes rolling back in her head. "Vivian," Brad shouted, reaching out, but he was too slow. My ex-wife crumpled to the driveway, fainting dead away, her body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. She lay there like a discarded doll in her expensive silk robe. I took a step forward, instinct kicking in, wanting to help her. But then I stopped. She wasn't my wife anymore. She wasn't my responsibility. She had made her choice. Brad knelt beside her, slapping her cheeks, trying to wake her up. Mom, wake up!" He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a hatred that was truly demonic. "You killed her!" he screamed. "You killed her, you heartless bastard! She is just fainting." "Brad," I said, "she always faints when the bill comes due." Brad let out a roar, a primal animalistic sound. He jumped up, leaving Vivian on the ground, and ran back toward the house, but he didn't go inside for a phone or water. He stopped at the sports rack by the garage door. He grabbed a baseball bat, a heavy wooden Louisville Slugger I had bought for him 2 Christmases ago. He turned around, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. He wasn't a real estate agent anymore. He was a cornered rat showing his teeth. "I am going to kill you," he shrieked, marching down the driveway, swinging the bat, testing its weight. "I am going to smash your skull in." "Desmond," I stood my ground. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't back away. I just watched him come. Sal opened the door of the bulldozer, ready to jump down and help me, but I held up a hand, signaling him to stay put. "Come on, Brad," I said softly. "Come and show me what kind of man you really are." He crossed the property line, stepping onto the public road where I stood. He raised the bat high above his head, his face twisted into a mask of pure violence. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just looked him in the eye and waited for the swing that would end it all, one way or another. The sirens cut through the morning air long before the blue and red lights reflected off the polished glass of my old house. It was the sound of a man who had run out of lies and was reaching for the only weapon he had left, the authority of others. Brad was standing by the gate, his chest puffed out like a rooster, his hand gripping his phone so tight his knuckles were white as bone. He was pointing at me, shouting at the 2 officers who had just stepped out of their cruiser as if I were a common thief caught with my hand in the register. "Officer, arrest this man!" Brad screamed, his voice cracking with a desperation he could no longer hide. "He is trespassing. He brought a bulldozer onto my private property. He is threatening my family and my home. Look at the sign he put up. He is insane." The two officers looked at the bulldozer idling on the lawn, then at the bright orange sign on the gate, then at me. I recognized the older one, Sergeant Miller, a man who had walked this beat for 20 years and knew every crack in the sidewalk. He looked at the situation, then looked at Brad with a weary expression that said he had seen too many family squabbles turn ugly on a Saturday morning. "Hold on now," Mr. Miller said, raising a calm hand. "Let us just take a breath. Mr. Perkins, do you want to tell me what is going on here?" I did not have to say a word. I just stepped aside as Marcus, my lawyer, climbed out of my Ford pickup truck carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been through a war. Marcus did not look like a high-priced shark today. He looked like a man of the law, calm, steady, and backed by a mountain of paper. "Good morning, Sergeant," Marcus said, his voice echoing the professional tone of the officers. "I am Marcus Vance, legal counsel for Mr. Desmond Perkins, the sole owner of this land." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick document embossed with the golden seal of the county archives. "This is the original deed of title for parcel number 409, also known as this entire lot." Brad let out a bark of a laugh that sounded more like a choke. "That is a lie," he shouted. "My wife, Vivian, owns this house. The divorce decree was finalized yesterday. The judge gave her the house and I am her legal representative. Here are our papers." He shoved a folder toward the sergeant, who took it and began to read carefully. Brad looked at me, his eyes full of a frantic triumph, as if he expected the handcuffs to come out any second. Miller scanned Brad's papers, then looked at Marcus's deed. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I am not a real estate lawyer, gentlemen, but these papers both look official to me. It says here the wife owns the structure, but this deed says Mr. Perkins owns the land. How does that work?" "That is where the ground lease comes in," Sergeant Marcus explained, stepping forward and pointing to a specific paragraph in the deed, back in 1980. "Mr. Perkins structured this property as a bifurcated asset. The house and the land are legally separate entities for 40 years. The house had a right to be here under a specific lease agreement, but that lease had a very clear termination clause." Marcus turned his gaze toward Brad, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "The moment the divorce was finalized, the lease was voided by law because the landowner did not consent to a transfer of the lease to a new owner or a new use, specifically the condominium project Mr. Brad here has been bragging about to the neighbors." Brad's face went from red to a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the sergeant, then at the house as if he were seeing it for the first time as a separate object from the ground beneath his feet. "That is impossible," he whispered. "You cannot just separate a house from the dirt. It is one thing. In the eyes of the law, it is two," Marcus replied. "And right now the house is an unauthorized encroachment on private property. It is no different than if you parked a trailer on Mr. Perkins' lawn without asking his permission." Sergeant Miller rubbed his chin, looking at the massive bulldozer, then back at Brad. "Well now, son," he said, his voice dropping into a low drawl. "If what this lawyer says is true, and he has the county seal to prove it, then you are the one in the wrong here. I cannot arrest a man for being on his own land, and I certainly cannot stop him from wanting to clear his own lot." "This is my home!" Brad shrieked, his voice reaching a pitch that made the neighbors down the block stop and stare. "You cannot just tell me to move it." Miller looked up at the two-story colonial mansion with its brick facade and heavy oak doors. He looked at the intricate landscaping and the winding driveway. Then he looked back at Brad with a dry, humorless smile that reached his eyes. "Actually, that is exactly what the law says," Mr. Miller replied. He leaned against his cruiser, crossing his arms over his chest. "According to these papers, you have every right to keep that house. It is yours fair and square, but you do not have a right to keep it on this man's dirt. So you have got two choices. You can either reach an agreement with the landowner, which it seems you have already failed to do, or you can find a way to take your house somewhere else." Brad stared at him, his jaw dropping. "Take it somewhere else. It is a 3-ton brick structure." "You are kidding me, right?" "I am not kidding," Sergeant Miller said, tipping his cap toward me. "I have seen people move houses before. They put them on big flatbeds and haul them down the highway at 2 in the morning. But I reckon a house this size might be a bit of a trick. Tell you what, Brad, if you are really in a hurry, maybe you ought to call a heavy lift company and see if they can get a couple of Chinooks or a crane helicopter to cow it out of here, because as of right now, you are officially a squatter in a very expensive box." I watched Brad's spirit break right there on the driveway. The arrogance, the swagger, the fake smiles. It all crumbled away, leaving behind a small, terrified man who realized he had borrowed $500,000 for a building that was about to be declared junk. Vivian was still standing on the porch, frozen like a statue, her eyes wide as she listened to the sergeant confirm her nightmare. I stepped forward and looked Brad in the eye. I did not feel joy. I did not feel vengeance. I just felt the cold satisfaction of a job. Well done. 47 hours. Brad, I said, my voice low so only he could hear. The clock is ticking and the diesel in that bulldozer is full. You can call the police all you want, but the law lives in the dirt, and the dirt belongs to me. The sergeant nodded to me and climbed back into his car. Miller looked out the window at Brad one last time and said, "You might want to start packing, son. Because if Desmond Perkins says he is going to move something, he usually moves it, and I would hate for you to be inside when the dust starts flying." The sirens faded into the distance, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the house itself was starting to sink into the earth that was ready to reclaim it. They say that when a building collapses, it is rarely the roof that fails first. It is always the foundation. A small crack, a shift in the soil, a missing bolt that nobody bothered to check until the weight of the world comes pressing down. Brad thought he was building a skyscraper on my grave, but he forgot that the earth belongs to the man who knows how to dig, and by Monday morning the gravity he had ignored for so long was starting to pull him under. I sat in my motel room with the curtains drawn tight, the only light coming from the glowing screen of my laptop. I was watching the headlines of the local business journals and the real estate alerts Marcus had set up for me in the world of high-stakes development news travels like a brush fire, and Brad's name was the fuel word had leaked that the Vivian estate was dead on arrival. The rumors of a clouded title had reached the ears of every broker from Buckhead to Midtown, and the sharks were already circling the carcass. I received a call from Marcus at 10:30, his voice sounding like he had just won the lottery. "Des, you wouldn't believe the carnage," he said, laughing. "The bank didn't just freeze the construction loan, they issued a notice of immediate default. They found out the house they used for collateral is legally classified as an encroachment. They told Brad that unless he produces a signed land deed by noon, he has to pay back the initial $500,000 in full plus interest and penalties." "500,000, I whispered, looking at the stained carpet beneath my boots. "He doesn't have it." "Marcus, he spent the deposit on the architectural fees and the marketing campaign." "I know," Marcus replied, "and it gets better. The condo project partners, the guys Brad convinced to chip in another $300,000, found out about the bulldozer. They realize the landowner is a man who isn't afraid to tear the whole thing down. They pulled their funding an hour ago, and they are suing Brad for misrepresentation and fraud." It was the domino effect I had planned. For the first tile was the land deed. The second was the bank, and now the whole line was falling down, crushing everything in its path. Brad had gambled with money that wasn't his, and the house was calling his bluff. I imagined Brad standing in that marble kitchen with the leaky roof, the rain from the weekend probably still dripping into buckets on the floor. I imagined him looking at his phone, seeing the emails from his partners, turning into threats, seeing his bank account balance shrinking as the fees piled up. He had traded a father's respect for a dream made of glass, and now the glass was shattering. Then came the silence for 2 hours. My phone stayed dark. I knew the storm was brewing inside that house. I knew the arguments were echoing through the halls. Vivian would be realizing that the $200,000 she stole from our joint account, the money I had saved for our retirement, was gone, swallowed up by Brad's non-refundable deposits and failed promises. She had traded her security for a son-in-law who was nothing more than a silver-tongued thief. At 1 o'clock, my phone finally vibrated. It wasn't Brad, it wasn't Vivian, it was Keisha. My daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders, the girl whose first house I had built with my own sweat and blood. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the green button. The pain of her betrayal was still a raw wound in my chest, but I answered. "Hello, Keisha." The sound that came through the line wasn't words. It was a sob, a deep, ragged sound of a woman who had reached the end of her rope. "Dad," she choked out. "Dad, please tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't do this." "I didn't do anything, Keisha," I said, my voice soft but firm as granite. "I just stood on my own ground." "How could you be so cruel?" Keisha wailed, her voice rising into a scream of desperation. "The bank is taking everything. Dad, they are going to garnish Brad's wages. They are going to take Mom's car. They are saying we committed fraud." They are threatening to put Brad in jail, Dad. He's my husband. He's the father of your grandkids. How can you sit there and watch us drown? You chose the water, Keisha, I replied. I told you both to be careful. I told you that a house needs a foundation, but you were too busy looking at the luxury finishes to care about the man who laid the bricks. You watched your husband tat your mother-in-law and kick your father out of his own home. You stood by while they changed the locks on a man who never did anything but provide for you, Dad. We were just trying to build a future, Keisha cried, her words coming out in a frantic rush. Brad said it was for all of us, he said. We would be millionaires, he said. You would be happy in a nice condo where you didn't have to work anymore. We just wanted to be successful. Dad, is that a crime? It is a crime to steal a man's dignity, Keisha, I said. And it is a crime to build your success on the ruins of your father's life. Brad didn't want a future for me. He wanted a paycheck. He wanted to be the big man in the suit, and he used my life as his down payment. You are killing us, Dad. Keisha sobbed, the sound of her heart break through the phone, making my eyes sting. You are literally killing your own family over a piece of dirt. Is that what 40 years of being a father was worth to you, just to win a legal battle, just to see us lose everything? I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool glass of the motel window. I felt the weight of her words, the guilt that every father feels when his child is in pain. But then I remembered the feeling of the concrete walkway against my back. I remembered the sound of Brad's laughter as he kicked my suitcases down the stairs. I remembered Vivian's cold eyes as she told me I was useless. No, Keisha, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. I didn't kill this family. I just stopped holding it up when you started kicking the pillars 40 years ago. I built a foundation. For you, I built it on hard work, on honesty, and on respect. I gave you a solid place to stand, but you let Brad come in with his greed and his ego, and you let him hammer away at that foundation until it was nothing but dust. Brad didn't just want the house, Keisha, I continued. He wanted to erase me. He wanted to prove that the old man was a fool who could be cheated out of his own life. He gambled everything on the idea that I wouldn't fight back, and he lost. Please, Dad. Keisha pleaded, her voice a whisper. Now just sign the paper, sign the land over to the bank, and they will stop the lawsuit. We can move back in. We can start over. I'll make sure they treat you better, I promise. Just please don't let us lose the house. I looked at the orange sign I had stapled to the gate, the sign that was still visible in my mind. I thought about the house, the beautiful colonial with the master suite and the garden and the 3-car garage. It was a beautiful structure, but it was built on a lie, and I have spent my whole life knowing that you cannot fix a bad structure by painting the walls. I am sorry, Keisha, I said, and I meant it, but the answer is no. Dad, please, she screamed, her voice breaking. You are a monster. How can you do this to us? I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs for the first time in days. I felt a strange kind of peace, the peace that comes when the structure finally falls and there is nothing left to hide. I am not a monster, Keisha. I am a builder, and a builder knows when a building is beyond saving. I built the foundation 40 years ago with love and sacrifice, but your husband decided to dap it down. He thought he could build something better on top of my pain. Well, now the weight is too much, and the bricks are falling. She started to cry again, a hopeless sound that I knew would haunt me for a long time, but I didn't hang up. I let her speak her final words. I hate you, she whispered. I hate you for this. I know you do, I replied. But someday when the dust settles, you will realize that I didn't take anything from you. I just stopped letting you take from me. Don't cry when the bricks fall on your head, Keisha. I warned you the structure was shifting. You just didn't want to listen. I hung up the phone and set it down on the nightstand. The silence in the room was absolute. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The sun was setting over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the city. The dominoes were all down now. Brad was ruined. Vivian was broke, and Keisha was lost. But as I stood there in the quiet, I realized that the dirt was still there, the land was still solid, and for the first time in a very long time, I had a clear view of the horizon. The house was gone in every way that mattered, but the builder was still standing, and that was enough. They say a house is a living thing, and like any living thing, it needs a pulse to survive. But the pulse of a home isn't the family or the memories or the expensive furniture. It is the flow of energy and water, the silent systems that we take for granted until they are gone for 3 days. I sat in my motel room and watched the grid on my tablet. The smart sensors I had installed in the main line told me exactly what was happening at the estate on Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. The power company disconnected the service because the account was in my name, and the owner of the land had requested a final reading at 10:30. The water main was shut off for the same reason. I could almost hear the silence descending on that $2 million mansion, a silence that was heavy and dark and cold. Vivian thought she had won the castle, but she forgot that the castle belonged to the king, and the king had taken the keys to the engine room. I imagined her sitting in that marble kitchen trying to turn on the lights and finding only darkness. I imagined her turning the gold-plated faucets and hearing only the hollow hiss of air in the pipes. A mansion without water is just a very expensive cave, and a mansion without power is a tomb for luxury. On Wednesday night, the smart lock on my motel room chirped, and I heard the sound of a luxury car idling in the parking lot. I didn't have to look through the curtain to know who it was. The scent of expensive perfume began to seep under the door, a smell that used to mean home, but now just smelled like betrayal. There was a knock. Not the aggressive pound of Brad, but a soft, hesitant tap. The tap of a woman who had realized the ground was no longer beneath her feet. I opened the door and stood there in the doorway, the yellow light of the motel hallway casting a long shadow over her. Vivian looked like a ghost. Her designer silk dress was wrinkled, her hair was flat, and she looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She was holding a designer bag like a shield, but the shield was cracked. "Desmond," she whispered. Her voice cracked and dry. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, not out of kindness, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see the look in her eyes now that the lights were out. She walked into the small room, looking at the stained carpet and the flickering television, with a look of utter disgust. She sat on the edge of the only chair, and for a moment we just sat there in the silence of the highway night. "It is dark." "Desmond," she finally said, her voice trembling, "the house is dark and cold and the water is gone. The bank took the Mercedes this morning because Brad hadn't made the lease payments and the neighbors are staring. I cannot even wash my face. Desmond, I cannot even flush the toilet." I leaned against the dresser, crossing my arms over my chest. I didn't offer her water. I didn't offer her comfort. I just watched her fall apart. "You should call Brad," I said, my voice flat. "He is the one with the vision. Remember? He is the one building the future. Brad is gone," she cried, burying her face in her hands. "He left this morning. He said he had a meeting in Charlotte, but he took all the cash from the safe and his bags were packed. He isn't coming back, Desmond. He left me in that. He left. House alone with the debt and the lawsuits and the darkness. I wasn't surprised. A rat is always the first to jump when the ship starts taking on water, but Vivian didn't look at me with anger anymore. She looked at me with a desperate pleading that made my stomach turn. "Desmond." "Please," she said, standing up and taking a step toward me. "We have 40 years between us. 40 years of life, of building that home, of raising Keisha. You can't just let me rot like this. I know I was wrong. I know I listened to Brad too much, but I am still your wife. We stood before God and promised to stay together until the end. You are a good man, a Christian man. You cannot do this to me." I looked at her, really, looked at her. I saw the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. The same eyes that had looked at me with contempt just a week ago. She was playing the 40 years card. She was trying to use our history as a tether to pull me back into the swamp of her greed. 40 years. I repeated the words, felt heavy in my mouth, like stones you want to talk about. 40 years, Vivian, you want to talk about the sacred vows we made. "Yes," she sobbed, grabbing my sleeve with a trembling hand. "We have so much history. Desmond, don't let a few bad weeks erase 4 decades of love." I reached into my leather satchel, the one I had taken from the house the day she kicked me out. I pulled out a small plastic sleeve containing a single yellowed piece of paper. It wasn't a land deed. It wasn't a contract. It was a hotel receipt from the Grand Hyatt in Savannah, dated June 14th, 2016. I held it out to her, my hand as steady as the foundation of a skyscraper. Her eyes scanned the paper, and I watched the blood drain from her face until she was as white as the silk she was wearing. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It is the day our marriage ended, Vivian," I said, my voice low and cold as the winter wind. "You think this started with Brad. You think this started with the house. But the rot began 10 years ago. Knew about Reginald Vivian. I knew about the weekends in Savannah. I knew about the jewelry he bought you with the money I was earning on the construction sites in 90-degree heat. Vivian shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know what you are talking about. That was just a friend. It was a mistake. It was a choice. I corrected her, and I have the photos and the phone records to prove it. I have had them for 10 years. I sat at our dinner table every night and looked at you knowing you were a stranger. I stayed Vivian because I wanted to see Keisha graduate. I stayed because I wanted to make sure my business was secure. I stayed because I was building a trap, and I wanted to see if you would ever have the decency to tell me the truth. I took a step closer, my shadow swallowing her completely. You never did. You just kept taking. You took my loyalty. You took my money. And then when you thought you didn't need me anymore, you tried to take my dignity and my home. You talked about 40 years of marriage. Like it was a prison sentence for you, but for me it was a decade of watching a thief live in my house. Desmond, I was lonely. You were always working. She tried to justify it, her voice rising in a desperate whine. I was working to build a kingdom for you. I roared, my voice shaking the thin walls of the motel room. I was working so you could wear silk and drive a Mercedes and look down your nose at the people who actually sweat for a living. I gave you everything, and you gave me a receipt for a hotel room in Savannah. I grabbed the divorce papers from the nightstand, the ones that gave her the house and gave me nothing, and I threw them at her feet. Our marriage didn't end when the judge stamped those papers. Vivian, it ended 10 years ago. I just stayed around to watch the walls fall down. You wanted the house, you got it. Enjoy the darkness, enjoy the thirst. Because the man who fixed the leaks and paid the bills is dead to you. Desmond, please. She fell to her knees, her expensive dress trailing in the motel dust. I have nowhere to go. I have no money. Brad took it all. Then you should start walking, I said, turning my back on her. I gave you 30 days. To be honest, I gave you a lifetime to be loyal. You chose the structure over the foundation. Now the structure is dead, and I am reclaiming the dirt. I walked to the door and opened it wide, the sound of the interstate filling the room, a constant reminder of the world moving on without her. Get out, Vivian, I said. She stood up slowly, her spirit completely broken. She looked like an old woman for the first time in her life. She walked past me into the night, her head down, her shoulders slumped. She didn't look back. She didn't say another word. She just vanished into the dark, heading back to a mansion that was no longer a home. I closed the door and locked it. For the last time, I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face, feeling the weight of 10 years of secrets finally lifting off my shoulders. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim or a husband or a contractor. I saw a man who was finally free. The 40 years were over, but the truth was just beginning. I sat back down on the bed and opened my notebook. I had a lot of work to do. The house was going to be demolished on Monday, and I needed to decide what to build on the empty lot. I thought about a garden, maybe a park for the neighborhood kids, something honest, something that didn't need silk or Botox to be beautiful. I fell asleep that night listening to the rain on the roof, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't dream of Savannah. I dreamed of the dirt, and the dirt was clean. A cornered rat does not care about the law or the rules of engagement. It only cares about the bite, and Brad was the biggest rat I had ever seen in my life for 2 days. The silence from the house was absolute. No lawyers called, no sheriff arrived, no more tantrums on the sidewalk. I sat in my motel room watching the shadows grow long on the pavement, and I knew the silence was not peace. It was a fuse burning down. Brad had lost his loan, he had lost his dignity, and he was about to lose his mind. And when a man like Brad loses everything, he stops trying to be smart and starts trying to be cruel. It happened at 3 a.m. on Thursday, the kind of hour when the world feels thin and the only people awake are the ones with something to hide. I was sitting in the dark of room 114, sipping a glass of water, when I heard the low rumble of a car with a modified muffler creeping into the motel parking lot. It didn't pull into a space, it just idled near the back of my Ford pickup truck. I didn't turn on the light, I didn't move the curtain. I just reached for my tablet on the nightstand and opened the surveillance app. Most people see an old man in a flannel shirt and think he still uses a rotary phone, but they forget that I spent 40 years running high-security construction sites in the roughest parts of Atlanta I have seen every kind of thief and vandal there is. And I learned a long time ago that eyes in the back of your head are not enough. You need eyes that never blink. I had installed 4 hidden 4K cameras in that truck before I left the estate. 1 in the grill, 1 in the bed, and 2 in the side mirrors, all linked to a private cloud server. On the screen, I saw 2 figures step out of a battered sedan. They were wearing hoodies pulled low and masks over their faces. They didn't look like professionals. They looked like the kind of lowlifes you hire with a handful of $100 bills and a promise of no consequences. One of them was carrying a heavy iron pipe. The other had a plastic gallon jug that smelled of gasoline. Even through the digital feed, I watched as the one with the pipe walked up to my truck, my beautiful 1995 Ford, the one I had kept pristine for 30 years. He didn't hesitate. He swung the pipe with a grunt of effort, smashing the driver's side window. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the motel courtyard, like a gunshot. He hit the hood, denting the metal, then moved to the headlights. Glass spraying everywhere under the yellow motel lights. The other one didn't go for the truck. He walked toward the small metal storage unit at the edge of the lot, the one I had rented to house my life's work, my tools, the heavy-duty saws, the levels, the drills, the things that had built half the skyline of this city. He splashed the gasoline across the door and the wooden pallet it sat on. Then he struck a match. The orange flare illuminated his masked face for a split second before he dropped it. The fire took hold instantly, a hungry blue flame that turned into a roaring orange wall of heat. I sat there watching my history burn. My heart was pounding in my chest and my hands were gripped tight around the tablet. I wanted to run out there. I wanted to show them what 40 years of manual labor can do to a man's grip, but I stayed in the chair. I had seen something in the background of the video, a silver Porsche idling. Across the street, under a broken street lamp, I zoomed in on the mirror camera. There he was, Brad sitting behind the wheel watching the fire with a grin on his face. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't think he needed one because he thought the old man was asleep and the cameras were non-existent. Brad thought he was destroying my power. He thought if he took my truck and my tools, I would have nothing left to fight with. He thought he was breaking my spirit. But as I watched the smoke billow into the night sky, I realized he was just handing me the final nail for his coffin. The thugs jumped back into their car and peeled out the Porsche, following close behind. They disappeared into the night, leaving the smell of burnt oil and melted plastic hanging in the air. The motel manager finally woke up and called the fire department. Sirens began to wail in the distance, but I still didn't move. I just hit the save button on the recording and started a new email. I didn't call the police, not yet a police. Report is just a piece of paper that ends up in a file, and Brad has friends in the city council. He would have lied his way out of it or blamed it on a disgruntled former employee. No, I needed to hit him where it actually hurt. I needed to take his future. I typed in the email address for Arthur Henderson, the CEO of Henderson & Associates, the most prestigious real estate firm in the South. Arthur was a man of old-school values, a man who had built his reputation on integrity and class, and more importantly, he was Brad's boss, the man who had the power to fire Brad and pull his license with a single phone call. I had done the foundation work for Arthur's personal estate 20 years ago, and we had stayed in touch. I knew Arthur hated 2 things, above all else: scandal and cowards. Subject, urgent, security. Footage regarding Bradley Miller, I wrote. I didn't add any long explanations. I didn't cry about my tools. I just attached the file, the one that showed the thugs smashing the truck and then the crystal clear shot of Brad sitting in his silver Porsche across the street smiling as the fire grew. Dear Arthur, I wrote, my fingers steady on the keys. I thought you should see the extracurricular activities of your senior broker before I hand this over to the district attorney. As you can see, Bradley has moved from real estate to arson. I trust you will handle this with the professionalism your firm is known for. Best regards, Desmond Perkins. I hit send and watched the little progress bar fill up. It was 4:30 in the morning. The fire trucks were finally dousing the flames in the storage unit. My tools were probably slag by now, and my truck was a wreck, but I felt a weight lifting off my chest. Brad thought he could play dirty because I was old and quiet, but he forgot that the quiet ones are the ones who listen, and when you listen, you learn exactly how to destroy a man without ever touching him. I walked out of the room as the sun began to peek over the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of charcoal. I walked up to my ruined truck and ran a hand over the shattered glass. It was just metal. I thought it can be replaced, but a reputation, once it burns, is gone forever. The motel manager ran up to me, his face white with fear. "Mr. Perkins, I am so sorry we saw them on our cameras, but they were too fast. I already called the cops." "Don't worry about it," I said, tipping my cap. "I already took care of it." I sat on the tailgate of my broken truck and waited at exactly 8 a.m. My phone rang. It wasn't the police. It was Arthur Henderson Desmond, he said, his voice tight with a cold fury. "I just watched the video. I have no words. I have already called security to escort Bradley out of the building. His accounts are frozen, and I am personally filing a complaint with the real estate board to have his license revoked for life. He is done. Desmond, he will never sell so much as a birdhouse in this state again." "Thank you, Arthur," I said. "What do you want me to do with the footage?" he asked. "Keep it. For now," I said. "I'll be in touch." I hung up and looked toward the north, toward the estate. I imagined Brad showing up for work this morning in his silk suit, ready to celebrate my defeat. I imagined the look on his face when the security guards blocked the elevator. I imagined him realizing that the fire he started didn't burn my life. It only burned his own bridge back to civilization. I reached into the bed of the truck and found a small hammer that had survived the fire. Its handle was scorched, but the steel was still strong. I gripped it tight, feeling the weight of it in my hand. "You wanted a war, Brad," I whispered to the wind, "and you finally got one. But you brought a match to a fight where I own the fuel. Now watch the whole thing burn." News in a city like Atlanta doesn't walk, it runs. Especially when it involves a golden boy and a silver Porsche being caught on camera torching an old man's livelihood by 10 a.m. on Friday. The video I sent to Arthur Henderson wasn't just in his inbox, it was the lead story on the local real estate blogs. The headline read, "The Arsonist Agent," and the image of Brad's smug face glowing in the light of my burning tools was everywhere. He had spent years building a brand of luxury and trust, and I destroyed it with a 60-second clip of digital truth. I parked my truck across the street from the Henderson and Associates headquarters, hidden behind a row of magnolias. I wanted to see the exact moment his world stopped spinning. I watched as Brad pulled his Porsche into his reserved spot, oblivious to the storm he was still wearing. A tailored suit, looking like a man who expected a promotion. But when he reached the glass doors, he didn't see the usual smiles from the receptionists. He saw 2 large security guards standing in his path. They didn't even let him step onto the carpet. One of them handed him a cardboard box containing his desk ornaments, while the other handed him a formal notice of termination. His key card was swiped and dropped into the trash, right in front of him. I watched through my binoculars as Brad's jaw dropped, his hands shaking as he tried to argue, pointing toward the elevators, screaming about his commissions and his rights. But the security guards just pointed toward the street and told him to move his car before the tow truck arrived. But that was just the appetizer. The main course came an hour later when the Georgia Real Estate Commission issued an emergency suspension of his license. They don't take kindly to brokers who hire thugs to burn down competing interests or commit insurance fraud. Brad wasn't just unemployed, he was radioactive. No firm in the country would touch him, and the bank that had given him the construction loan was already filing a civil suit to seize his remaining assets. I sat in my truck and felt the vibration of my phone. It was a notification from the bank. My $10,000 check had cleared, but more importantly, my legal standing was now absolute with Brad under criminal investigation for arson. His claims against my land were dead in the water. He had tried to burn me out, but all he did was smoke himself into a hole he couldn't climb out of. By that afternoon, I decided to drive back to the estate, not to go inside, but to witness the aftermath. The gates were open, the security guards had given up and walked away because their paychecks had bounced. I sat in the driveway watching the shadows of the mansion lengthen on the grass. The sprinklers were silent. The house was dark and the air smelled of stale charcoal from the fire across the street. I walked toward the back patio, staying in the darkness of the trees. I could hear voices coming from the living room. The sliding glass doors were open to catch the evening breeze. Since the air conditioning was dead, I didn't need a microphone to hear the screaming. The structure I had built to house love was now a pressure cooker of hatred. Vivian was sitting on the floor in her silk robe, surrounded by candles she had bought at the grocery store. She looked like a shadow of herself, her face pale and sunken. Keisha was standing over her, her face red with tears, her voice cracking with a pain I had never heard before. "How could you let him do it?" Keisha shrieked, her voice echoing through the empty marble halls. "You knew he was taking the money, Mom. You knew he was gambling with our lives, and you just let him drain the accounts. You let him lie to me about the mortgage payments." "I didn't know." Vivian wailed, her voice thin and desperate. "He said it was for the project. He said he just needed a little more time to bridge the gap. He told me your father was the one destroying us. I trusted him, Keisha. He's your husband. He's a thief, Keisha screamed. She threw a stack of bank statements onto the floor near Vivian's feet. I went to the bank this afternoon to withdraw my personal savings. I wanted to hire a lawyer for the divorce case. I wanted to move us out of this dark house. And do you know what the teller told me? She told me the account was empty, Mom, empty. Vivian looked up, her eyes wide and glassy. What do you mean empty? You had $50,000 in there from your grandmother. Brad took it. Keisha sobbed, her body shaking with the force of her realization. He had my power of attorney for the real estate investment. He used it to pay off a bookie in Buckhead 2 weeks ago. He spent my inheritance on a football game. Mom, he robbed me. He robbed his own wife while he was telling me he loved me. The front door slammed and Brad stumbled into the room. He smelled like whiskey and failure. His tie was gone and his shirt was stained. He looked at the two women with a look of pure loathing. He didn't look like a golden boy anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. Oh, shut up, Keisha, he snarled, throwing his car keys onto the table. They didn't even make a sound in the heavy carpet. I did it for us. I was one win away from doubling that money. I was trying to save the project since your father decided to be a senile prick and ruin the land deal. If he had just signed the paper, none of this would have happened. You stole from me. Brad. Keisha marched up to him, her finger in his face. You lied to me for 2 years. You let me think we were building a life while you were burning it down. Get out of this house. Get out before I call the police and tell them everything. This is my house too, Brad shouted, his voice booming through the darkness. I have a legal right to be here until the bank auctions it off, and they won't do that for months, so you can sit here in the dark and cry for all I care. I am the one who lost a career today. I am the one who is being treated like a criminal. You are a criminal, Vivian whispered, standing up slowly to face him. You destroyed my marriage, you stole my retirement, and you ruined my daughter. I gave you everything, Brad. I treated you like a son, and you left me in a house with no water and no hope. Vivian reached out as if to slap him, but her hand was weak. Brad caught her wrist, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. Don't touch me, old woman. You were the one who wanted the divorce. You were the one who wanted the money as much as I did. Don't play the victim. Now you were happy to spend the cash when the champagne was flowing. So keep your mouth shut. Keisha let out a scream of pure rage and lunged at him. She started hitting his chest, her fists flying in a blind fury. You coward, you pathetic little man. I hate you. I wish I had never met you. Brad pushed her back hard, sending her stumbling into the sofa. He didn't care about the cameras anymore. He didn't care about the neighbors. He was drowning, and he wanted to drag them down with him. They started screaming at each other, all three of them at once, a cacophony of blame and betrayal. Vivian was crying about her lost status. Keisha was screaming about her stolen future, and Brad was shouting about how everyone had failed him. It was the sound of a structure collapsing from the inside out, the sounds of a family that had forgotten that a home is built on truth, not granite and glass. I stood in the darkness of the garden and watched them through the glass. They looked like shadows dancing in the candlelight, a twisted play of their own making. I realized then that I didn't need the bulldozer to destroy them. They were doing it themselves. They were tearing each other apart bit by bit until there was nothing left but the bones of their greed. I walked away from the patio, my boots crunching on the gravel path. I didn't feel sorry for them. I didn't feel the urge to step in and save them. The house was dark, but for the first time in 10 years, I could see clearly. I walked back to my truck and looked at the moon, the same moon that had watched me build this place with my own hands. They were in there fighting over a house that had no right to exist on land. They didn't own. They were clinging to walls that were already condemned by their own actions. I climbed into my cab and started the engine, moving away from the noise and the darkness. Let them say each other, I thought as I drove toward the gate. Let them realize that when the power goes out, the only thing you have left is the person standing next to you. And if that person is a thief, then you are truly alone. I had the dirt, I had the truth, and soon I would have my peace. The final chapter was coming, and I wouldn't even have to lift a finger to write it. The knock on the door of room 114 was different. This time, it was not the violent pound of a man who thought he was a king. It was the heavy, desperate thud of someone who knew the castle walls were falling in. I sat at the small, wobbly desk in the corner of the motel room, a single lamp casting long, tired shadows across the floor. I didn't get up immediately. I let them wait. Silence is the only thing people like Vivian and her lawyers understand when their power has been stripped away, like old paint. I took a slow sip of water and looked at the clock on the wall. 8 p.m. The clock was ticking, and every second was $1. They were losing in interest and legal fees. I stood up and opened the door. The humid Georgia air pushed its way inside, bringing with it the smell of exhaust and impending rain. Vivian stood there looking like she had aged a decade in a single week. Her expensive designer suit was wrinkled, and her eyes were rimmed with red. She wasn't alone. She had brought a new lawyer, a man with a tired face and a cheap briefcase who looked like he spent his days chasing lost causes. They didn't wait for an invitation. They pushed past me into the room, looking at the stained walls and the sagging bed with a mixture of horror and pity. "Can we sit, Desmond?" The lawyer asked, his voice sounding like dry leaves rustling on a sidewalk. "You can stand, or you can leave," I said, closing the door and locking it. "I don't have enough chairs for guests who come to my home uninvited." Vivian let out a shaky breath, clutching her handbag to her chest like a shield. "Desmond, please, we are here to be reasonable. The bank has filed an injunction, and Brad is facing criminal charges for that mess with your truck. It is all falling apart, Desmond. The house is going into foreclosure because the title is clouded. Nobody wins if the bank takes it all." I leaned against the dresser, crossing my arms over my chest. My eyes were cold as I watched her try to play the victim again. "So what do you want, Vivian? Why are you in my motel room at 8 o'clock at night?" "We have a proposal," the lawyer said, stepping forward and clearing his throat. "My client is willing to sell her interest in the structure to you. She owns the physical building according to the divorce decree. We are prepared to offer you the entire mansion for the discounted price of $500,000. It is a steal. Desmond, that house is worth $2 million on the open market. You get your home back, and Vivian gets enough to settle the debts Brad created and move on with her life." $500,000. I repeated the words flat and hollow. I looked at the ceiling and let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like a saw hitting a knot in wood. $500,000 for a house that is currently trespassing on my dirt. You are joking, right? "It is not a joke, Desmond," Vivian cried, stepping closer, her perfume clashing with the smell of the motel's industrial cleaner. "It is a beautiful home. You built it yourself. You spent 40 years making it perfect. You can't tell me you want to see it destroyed. Think of the memories. Think of all the work you put into those walls. You can have it all back for a fraction of its value." I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain, looking out at the parking lot where Sal's bulldozer was still sitting on the flatbed truck, silhouetted against the streetlights. I turned back to her and the lawyer, my face a mask of stone. "You don't understand, do you?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, rumbling bass. "You are still thinking like people who live in brochures and luxury magazines. You see a $2 million mansion with marble floors and gold faucets, but I don't see that anymore. I am a builder, Vivian. I know what things are actually made of, and without the land, that house is nothing but a pile of heavy, expensive trash." "Trash," the lawyer sputtered, "Mr. Perkins. That is a premier property." "No," I corrected him. "It is a liability. It is 40,000 pounds of brick and wood that I didn't give permission to stay on my lot every hour. It sits there. It is costing me potential revenue, and every day it stays there. I have to pay taxes on the ground it is occupying. You are not offering me a home. Vivian, you are offering me a demolition project. You are asking me to pay you $500,000 for the privilege of cleaning up your mess." "Desmond, please." Vivian was shaking now, the silk of her scarf fluttering. "We need that money. Brad is in trouble. He owes people money. Desmond, dangerous people, and the bank is going to take everything if we don't pay the bridge loan by Monday morning. You have the money in your private account." "I know you do. Just buy the house and this can all be over. We will disappear and you can have your Vung Quoc back." I looked at her. Really, looked at her. I saw the Yu Mei in her eyes, the way she was still trying to protect the man who had robbed her blind. The man who had tried to burn her husband's life to the ground. She was still a slave to Brad's greed. Even now, when the roof was literally leaking over her head, I sat down on the bed, the springs groaning under my weight. I picked up a pen and a piece of scrap paper from the nightstand. I wrote a single number on it and slid it across the table toward the lawyer. He picked it up, his eyes widening. $10,000, he whispered. You are offering $10,000 for a $2 million estate. That is not an offer for an estate, I said, standing up and towering over them. That is a disposal fee. $10,000 is what I am willing to pay to take that trash off your hands and save you the cost of hiring a crew to do it. I am giving you back exactly what you gave me when you kicked me out of my own door. Remember that check, Vivian? Remember how you told me to go find a quiet place to die? Well, here is the quiet place and here is your check. You can't be serious, the lawyer said, his voice rising in anger. This is predatory, Desmond. The court will never allow this. The court has already ruled. I reminded him. The judge stamped those papers on Friday. The house belongs to her. The land belongs to me, and the law says she has until noon tomorrow to move her property. If it is still there at 12 o'clock, and 1 minute, I am going to tell Sal to start the engine and I am going to push that house into the ravine bit by bit, and then I am going to sue you for the cost of the fuel. Vivian started to sob, a loud, ugly sound of a woman who had finally run out of options. She looked at the lawyer, but he just looked at the floor. He knew the law. He knew I had them in a vice, and I was turning the handle until the metal, groaned Desmond. Please, she wailed, falling to her knees on the dirty motel carpet. Brad will be killed if I don't get that money. He is terrified, Desmond. They are coming for him. Please, for the sake of our daughter, don't do this. I looked down at her, and for a split second I felt a flicker of the man I used to be, the man who would have done anything to stop her from crying. But then I remembered the feeling of the concrete against my back. I remembered the smell of my tools burning in the night. I remembered the 40 years of silence while she planned her escape. Your son-in-law made his bed. Vivian, I said, my voice cold and final, and he can sleep in it, and you had every chance to walk away with half of everything. You had every chance to be honest, but you chose a thief over a builder. Now you can pay the price for the structure you chose to stand in. I took a fresh quitclaim deed from my satchel, the one Marcus had prepared, and I laid it on the desk next to the $10,000 check I had already signed. You have 5 minutes. I said, I am going to walk to the lobby to get a fresh cup of coffee. When I get back, you will either have signed that paper and taken the check, or I will call Sal and tell him to be at the gates at dawn. I didn't wait for her answer. I walked out of the room and into the cool night air. I walked slowly to the motel office, the sound of the interstate, a constant hum in the distance. I stayed in the lobby for exactly 5 minutes, staring at the coffee machine, watching the dark liquid fill the cup. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't joy. It wasn't the thrill of revenge. It was just the feeling of a building finally being leveled so the land could be clear again. When I walked back into room 114, the lawyer was standing by the door, looking defeated. Vivian was still on the floor, her head bowed, her body shaking with silent sobs. The paper was on the desk, signed in her elegant, shaky handwriting. She had taken the $10,000 check, the check that would barely cover a month's interest on Brad's debts. She stood up slowly, not looking at me. She walked toward the door, her movements stiff like a wooden doll. The lawyer picked up his briefcase and followed her out, pausing for a moment in the doorway. You are a hard man, Desmond Perkins, he said. I am a builder, I replied, closing the door behind them, and I know better than anyone that you cannot save a structure once the rot reaches the core. I sat back down at the desk and picked up the signed deed. I ran my thumb over the signature, Desmond Perkins, land and house. I was finally the owner of my own world again. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. It is done, I said. File the papers first thing in the morning. The house is mine for $10,000. Tell the bank I will be in on Monday to discuss a new mortgage on my terms. I hung up the phone and turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Save for the red blinking light of the smoke detector, I lay down on the bed, and for the first time in a month, I slept a deep, dreamless sleep. I knew that tomorrow the sun would rise on an empty lot in my heart, but on Monday I would start building something new, something honest, and this time I would make sure the foundation was built to last forever. I watched the ink dry on the quitclaim deed, like I was watching the last few seconds of a funeral. The room was so quiet you could hear the neon sign humming outside and the ragged breath of a woman who had finally realized she was holding a handful of ashes. Vivian's hand was still trembling as she pulled the envelope toward her, $10,000 in cold, hard cash. It was a pittance, a fraction of the millions she thought she was owed. But in that moment, it was the only thing between her and the street. I had made sure it was cash because I wanted her to feel the physical weight of her betrayal. I wanted her to feel how light 40 years of marriage actually felt when you traded it for a stack of hundreds. Vivian clutched the envelope to her chest, her eyes red and sunken. She didn't look like the queen of the manor anymore. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck who had just found a piece of driftwood. But as she turned to leave the room, the shadow in the corner moved. Brad had been standing by the door, silent and brooding, watching that envelope like a hawk, watching a field mouse. He had been ruined. His career was gone. His reputation was a pile of charcoal, and he was looking at that $10,000, not as a way to save Vivian, but as a way to save himself. We walked out into the motel parking lot. The Georgia air was thick and heavy with the scent of an approaching storm. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the rusted frame of my old truck and the sleek silver Porsche that Brad was still clinging to, even though the repo man was probably only an hour away. Keisha was standing by the car, her arms crossed over her chest, looking at the ground. She looked hollowed out like a building. After a fire where only the exterior walls are left standing. Desmond. Please, Keisha whispered as I stepped onto the pavement one last time. Can't you just give us a little more? You have so much, and we have nothing. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at her. I just walked to the gate of the motel lot and leaned against the chain-link fence, watching the play reach its final act. Vivian was walking toward the Porsche, clutching the money bag tight. She looked at Brad, her eyes filled with a desperate hope. We can get a motel in the next town, Brad, she said, her voice thin and shaking. We can use this to pay for a lawyer and maybe find a small place to rent until you get back on your feet. It is not much, but it is a start. Brad didn't look at her. He didn't even acknowledge her words. He was looking at the envelope in her hand. His eyes were wide and frantic, the eyes of a man who was already halfway down the road. In his mind, he reached out his hand, snapping his fingers. Give it to me, Vivian, he said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. Vivian blinked, her grip tightening on the money. But Brad, we need this for the hotel and for Keisha's things. I said, give it to me, Brad, roared his patience, snapping like a dry twig. He didn't wait for her to hand it over. He lunged forward, his hands like claws, snatching the envelope from her grasp. He pulled so hard that Vivian stumbled, her heels catching on the cracked asphalt, and she fell to her knees, her silk skirt tearing as it hit the grit of the parking lot. Brad Keisha screamed, running forward. What are you doing? That is all she has. Brad didn't stop. He scrambled into the driver's seat of the Porsche, his movements frantic and clumsy. He jammed the key into the ignition and the engine roared to life, a high-pitched scream of German engineering that sounded like a warning. He threw the envelope onto the passenger seat and slammed the door, locking it before Keisha could reach the handle. Brad opened the door. Vivian cried from the ground, her hands scratched and bleeding as she tried to pull herself up. Brad, please don't leave us here. Brad rolled down the window just an inch enough for the cold air to hit them, but not enough for them to reach inside. He looked at Keisha, then at Vivian, and for a second I saw the mask slip completely. There was no love there, no loyalty, not even a shred of guilt. There was only the cold calculation of a man who had decided to cut his losses. I am sorry, baby, Brad said, looking at Keisha, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. I cannot do this. I cannot be the man who lives in a motel room. I cannot be the man who works a regular job. I have to restart my life. I have to find a new way. And $10,000 is a tank of gas and a fresh start somewhere else. You are on your own, Brad. No, Keisha shrieked, banging her fists against the glass. You cannot leave me. I gave up everything for you. I lied to my father for you. You should have picked a winner then, Brad said, sneering. He shifted the car into gear, the tires chirping as he backed out of the space, nearly hitting the dumpster. Vivian was still on her knees, reaching out her hand as if she could pull the car back with her bare fingers. He didn't look back as he peeled out of the lot, the silver Porsche fishtailing on the wet pavement before disappearing into the darkness of the highway. Brad was gone with the only money they had left, leaving his wife and his mother-in-law standing in the rain in front of a $49 a night motel. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Vivian stayed on the ground, her head bowed, her silk robe soaked and covered in road grime. Keisha stood over her, her hands dropping to her sides, her shoulders slumped in a defeat, so absolute it was chilling. They were alone, truly alone in a world they had tried to buy with my blood. I stood by the fence watching them. I could feel the first drops of rain hitting my face, cool and clean. I looked at the gate, the iron bars that separated my world from theirs. I didn't feel the urge to run out there and pick Vivian up. I didn't feel the need to wrap Keisha in a blanket and tell her it was going to be okay. 40 years of history was screaming at me to do it, but 40 years of truth was telling me to stay put. Dad. Keisha called out, her voice a broken whisper as she turned toward the fence. She took a step toward me, her hands outstretched, pleading. Dad, please let us in. We have nowhere to go. The car is gone. The money is gone. Please, just for tonight. I looked at her. The girl I had built a dollhouse for 30 years ago. The girl I had walked down the aisle, only to watch her hand her loyalty to a wolf. I looked at Vivian, who was finally looking up at me, her face a mask of regret and terror. The structure is gone. Keisha, I said, my voice low and steady, carrying through the wind. The house is dead. The marriage is dead. And the man you used to call for help died the day you changed the locks. You chose your architect and he just drove away with the foundation. I reached, and grabbed the heavy iron lock on the gate. I clicked it shut. The sound of the metal bolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot in the empty street. I stepped back, leaving them on the other side of the bars in the rain and the dark. You have 48 hours to do what is left of your pride, I said, my eyes meeting Vivian's one last time. Then I am clearing the lot. I turned my back on them, walking toward the motel office. I didn't look back, even when I heard Vivian's wailing start again, even when I heard Keisha calling my name until her voice went hoarse. I went into my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and listened to the rain pounding on the roof. It was a violent storm, the kind that washes the streets clean. And as I sat there in the dark, I realized that the house was finally empty. The thieves were gone, the liars were exposed, and for the first time in a decade, the dirt underneath my feet felt solid. I was 72 years old. I had no house, no wife, and a ruined truck, but I had the land. And in this world, if you own the land, you can always build something new, something honest, something that won't fall down when the wind starts to blow. The morning sun hit the red bricks of the estate with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. The heavy, humid air of Georgia felt lighter as I pulled my Ford pickup into the driveway. The glass from my shattered window had been replaced, and the dents in the hood were badges of honor. Now, I wasn't the man who was kicked out with 2 garbage bags. I was the owner of the dirt, and now, finally, I was the owner of the walls again. The house stood silent and dark, like a giant who had lost its soul. But as I stepped out of the truck, I felt the pulse of the land beneath my boots. It was waiting for the master to return, and I had a lot of work to do. I didn't go inside immediately. I stood on the sidewalk and watched as a white van pulled up behind me. The logo on the side said Jackson's Locksmith and Security. I had called them at 6 a.m. because I wanted the first sound in this house to be the sound of a new beginning. 3 men stepped out carrying heavy metal cases and spools of wire. They didn't ask questions. They knew me. They had worked on my job sites for 20 years. They knew that when Desmond Perkins calls for a change of locks, he means a total fortification. Change every cylinder, I told the lead smith, a man named Curtis, who had the steady hands of a surgeon. I want high-security deadbolts on every exterior door, and I want the smart system wiped clean. Change the codes to the garage, the gate, and the wine cellar. If a ghost tries to walk through these doors, I want the sirens to wake up the whole county. I walked through the house while they worked. It felt cold and hollow. The smell of Vivian's expensive candles was gone, replaced by the scent of stagnant water and disappointment. I walked into the master bedroom where the rain had leaked through the temporary flashing. The drywall was stained and bubbling a yellow bruise on the ceiling that Brad had ignored because he was too busy dreaming of glass towers. I didn't feel sad looking at it. I felt a strange kind of excitement. I was a builder, and I knew exactly how to fix a bruise. By noon, the house was buzzing with activity. A painting crew was already in the kitchen scraping away the eggshell white that Vivian loved so much. I told them to paint it a deep, warm navy blue, the color of the ocean. At night, I wanted the house to stop looking like a museum and start looking like a home again. The plumbers were in the basement restoring the water, and the electricians were in the yard resetting the main breaker. When the lights finally flickered on, the house seemed to let out a long-held breath. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft whir of the air conditioning were the sounds of a heart starting to beat again. I was standing on the front porch, checking the tension on the new gate lock, when I saw a yellow cab pull up at the curb. It stopped at the edge of the property because the driver didn't have the code to the gate. I watched through the iron bars as a woman stepped out. She looked small, she looked fragile, she looked like someone who had been walking in the rain for a very long time. It was Vivian. She didn't have her designer bags. She didn't have her silk scarves. She was wearing a simple cotton dress that looked like it had been bought at a grocery store. Her head was down. Her shoulders were slumped, and she moved with the heavy gait of a woman who had run out of places to hide. She stood at the gate, looking at the keypad, her fingers hovering over the buttons. She tried the old code. I watched the small red light flash on the console indicating access. Denied. She tried it again, then again, her movements becoming more frantic. Then she saw me. She looked up through the bars, her eyes wide and wet, her face a mask of exhaustion and shame. "Desmond," she called out, her voice thin and wavering. "Please open the gate." I didn't move. I didn't reach for the remote. I just stood there with my arms crossed, looking at her through the iron fence I had built to protect her. "I have a lot of work to do, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying across the lawn. "I don't have time for visitors, Desmond. Please," she sobbed, grabbing the bars with her thin hands. "I have nowhere else to go. The bank locked the apartment in the city because Brad didn't pay the deposit. Keisha won't answer her phone, and I don't have a penny left in my name." I walked all the way from the bus station. "Desmond, my feet are bleeding. Please, I just need a place to sit down and some water." I looked at her feet and saw the cheap sandals she was wearing were indeed stained with blood. The queen of the manor was finally touching the dirt she had despised, and the dirt wasn't being kind to her. I felt a flicker of the old Desmond, the one who would have opened the gate in a heartbeat. But then I remembered the feeling of the concrete against my back. I remembered the sound of the bulldozer, and I remembered the look in her eyes. When she told me I was useless. "You chose your architect, Vivian," I said, "and you chose your structure. You wanted a divorce. You wanted the house, and you wanted me gone. Well, you got the divorce and you got the house, but then you sold it to me for $10,000. Remember, that was your choice, too." "I didn't sell it," she shrieked, her voice breaking. "Brad made me sign those papers. He lied to me." "Desmond, he told me you were going to take everything anyway. Please, I am 70 years old. You cannot leave me on the street like a dog." "I am not leaving you on the street," I corrected her. "I am leaving you exactly where you put me 30 days ago, outside the gate looking in." She collapsed to her knees, her head resting against the cold iron of the fence. She cried for a long time, a sound of pure brokenness that echoed off the brick walls of the neighborhood. I let her cry. I waited until she had nothing left but hiccups and gasps. Then I walked down the driveway and stood just inches away from her on the other side of the bars. "I have a proposal for you, Vivian," I said, my voice low and steady. She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes like a dying candle. "Anything, Desmond, anything. The house is mine now," I said. "I own the land, the walls and the roof, but it is a big house and I don't need all of it. I am going to move back into the master suite, but the guest suite on the first floor is empty. It has its own entrance and a small kitchenette. I am willing to let you stay there." "Oh, thank you. Thank you," she gasped, reaching through the bars to touch my boot. But I pulled back. I didn't say it was free. "Vivian," I said, "I am a contractor, and I know that every tenant has to pay their way. The rent for the guest suite is $2,000 a month. That is the market rate for this neighborhood. I will expect the first month's payment by the first of next month." $2,000, she whispered. "Where am I going to get $2,000? I don't have a job. I don't have anything. You have Social Security," said, "and you have that jewelry. You hidden in the safe deposit box. The pieces Brad didn't find yet, and if that isn't enough, you can find work. I hear the diner on 4th Street is looking for someone to prep vegetables. It is honest work. Vivian, something you might want to try." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a standard rental agreement, month to month, strict terms, no guests, no noise, no exceptions. I slid it through the bars along with a cheap plastic pen. "Sign this," I said, "and I will open the gate. You will be a tenant. Vivian, not a wife, not a partner, not a guest. You will follow the rules or I will evict you in 24 hours. Do you understand?" She looked at the paper, then at the house, then at me. She realized then that the trot too had been reset. The hierarchy was clear. I was the landlord, and she was just a woman who needed a roof. She picked up the pen and signed her name at the bottom, her signature small and trembling next to mine. I pressed the button on my remote and the iron gate swung open with a slow, mechanical groan. Vivian stood up and walked through the threshold, her head down. She didn't look like a woman coming home. She looked like a prisoner entering a cell. She walked past me toward the side entrance, her shoulders hunched as she disappeared into the shadows of the guest wing. I watched her go. Then I turned back to the house. I looked at the navy blue paint starting to cover the walls. I looked at the new locks and the bright lights. I was 72 years old, and my family was gone. But as I stood in the center of my garden, I felt a sense of peace that no mansion could ever buy. The structure was finally stable, the foundation was honest, and for the first time in 40 years, the man who built the house was finally the master of his own home. I walked inside, closed the door, and turned the new deadbolt. The click was final. The story of the betrayal was over, and the story of my life was just beginning. The late afternoon sun in Atlanta has a way of turning everything it touches into heavy molten gold. It is a thick, syrupy light that feels like a warm blanket over my shoulders as I sit on the front porch of the house I built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. The air is still and the neighborhood is quiet, the kind of deep, respectful quiet that only comes when the chaos has finally burned itself out and the dust has settled into the cracks of the pavement. I have a tall glass of iced tea in my hand, the condensation dripping down the glass and pooling in my palm. It is cold and sweet and honest. Every sip reminds me that I am still here. I am 72 years old, and I am the master of my own kingdom once again. I can feel the vibration of the world moving on without the people who tried to destroy me, and it is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. I didn't think I would find peace here again. I thought the memories of the betrayal would haunt the hallways like a bad smell that no amount of fresh paint could cover. But the house feels different now. It is no longer a museum for a woman's vanity or a playground for a son-in-law's greed. It is a fortress of truth. I look at the new navy blue paint on the shutters and the polished brass of the new locks, and I feel the stability of the foundation beneath my feet. A man spends his whole life building walls to keep his family safe, but he never expects those same walls to become a prison. Now the walls are just walls, and the land is just land. I am no longer a husband or a father who provides without question. I am a man who has reclaimed his name and his soul. Marcus called me this morning, his voice sounding clearer and lighter than it has in months. He didn't even say hello, he just started laughing, the low, gravelly laugh of a man who has seen justice served on a cold silver platter. He told me the news from Birmingham. Brad thought he could take his silver tongue and his fake brochures to Alabama and start over. He thought the laws of gravity and morality didn't apply to him once he crossed the state line. He thought he could find a new group of investors to lie to and a new family to exploit, but he was wrong. The FBI caught up with him at a cheap airport hotel where he was trying to hide after another one of his bridge loans collapsed. They didn't care about his silk suits or his vision. They arrested him for federal wire fraud and interstate money laundering. Marcus said the silver Porsche was towed away on a flatbed, its tires screeching against the metal as if the car itself was trying to escape the shame. Brad was led out in handcuffs, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and gym shorts. No cameras, no crowds of adoring fans, no champagne toasts. Just the cold metal of the law clicking shut around his wrists. He is looking at 20 years in a federal facility where the only real estate he will be managing is a 6-by-8-foot cell with a bunk bed and a stainless steel toilet. The man who wanted to build a glass tower ended up in a stone cage, and the irony is as sharp as a razor. He thought he outsmarted the old man, but he ended up being the fool in his own play. I took the old Ford truck out for a drive yesterday afternoon. The engine roared to life with a steady, confident growl that felt like a heartbeat. I needed some nails for the fence repair, and I decided to stop at the big box store on the edge of town. I didn't expect to see her, but there she was at register 4. Keisha was standing there, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes shadowed by a weariness that looked permanent. She was wearing a cheap polyester vest with a name tag that said, Associate Keisha. She was scanning groceries for a woman who looked exactly like Vivian, used to look wealthy, impatient, and demanding. I watched my daughter for a minute from a distance. I saw her hand a bag of heavy canned goods to a customer and apologize for a glitch in the register system. Her hands were red and chapped from the cold air of the freezer aisles, and she looked 20 years older than she did a month ago. She looked up and saw me for a split second as I walked toward the exit. Our eyes locked, and I saw the recognition flash across her face, followed by a deep, burning shame, and then a desperate hope that I would walk over and say the words she wanted to hear. I saw her lips move as if she were about to call out to me to ask for a loan or a place to sleep, or just a crumb of the love I used to give her so freely. But I didn't walk over. I didn't wave. I just paid for my nails at the self-checkout and walked out into the sun. Loyalty is a choice. Keisha and you chose a thief over a builder. You watched your husband humiliate your father, and you stood by while they tried to erase my existence for the sake of a paycheck. Now you have to learn how to count pennies and deal with the public, just like I had to learn how to survive in a motel room. It is a hard lesson to learn that blood doesn't buy you a free pass to betrayal, but it is the best lesson she will ever have. The structure she chose was made of sand, and now she is standing in the ruins. Back at the house, I can hear the floorboards creak in the guest wing. Vivian is still there. She is a shadow in her own former palace, a ghost who pays her rent on the first of every month. She follows the rules. She keeps her area clean, and she never comes into the main house. We don't speak about the past. We don't speak about Brad or the money or the nights in Savannah. We just exist in the same structure but on different foundations. She is learning what it means to be a tenant on land that she once thought was her birthright. She spends her days sitting on the small patio of the guest suite looking at the garden I am replanting. She looks like a woman who is finally seeing the dirt for what it is. I finished my tea and picked up the phone, dialing Marcus's office for the second time today. He answered on the second ring. "Desmond," he said, "what is on your mind now?" "Marcus, I said I need you to come by this weekend with your briefcase and a notary. I want to draft a new will." Marcus stayed silent for a moment, then he cleared his throat. "You already have a will, Des," he reminded me. "I want a new one," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. "I want to clear the slate completely. I am leaving this house, this land, and every cent I have saved to a new legacy. I want to create the Perkins Trade School for young men of color in this city. I want to build a place where boys who have nothing but their own two hands can learn how to handle a hammer and a level. I want them to learn the physics of a load-bearing wall and the law of a land deed. I want them to learn how to read a contract and how to pour a foundation that won't crack when the seasons change. I am giving them the tools to build their own kingdoms from the ground up, just like I did." "And what about the family?" Marcus asked, his voice soft. I looked out at the garden, at the oak trees standing tall and proud in the Georgia heat, their roots deep and unmovable. "Not a penny, Marcus," I said. "I am not leaving a single cent to the vultures who tried to pick my bones while I was still breathing. They wanted to take from me, so now I am giving to those who actually want to build." I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. I am 72 years old. I am alone in this big house, but I am not lonely. I am surrounded by the truth. I am the king of this dirt, and I am the master of these walls. The thieves are gone, and the liars are silenced. I looked at my hands, the calluses still there, the hard ridges of skin that have seen 4 decades of labor. They thought I was old and weak. They thought I was a relic of the past that could be pushed aside. They forgot that the man who built the house is the only one who knows exactly where the keystones are. I am Desmond Perkins, and my foundation is made of iron. A man's silence is not a sign of weakness. It is the sound of a trap being set. I spent 40 years building a foundation not just of concrete and steel, but of patience and law. They mistook my generosity for stupidity and my quietness for surrender. They forgot that the one who built the castle knows exactly where the keystones are. In life, never burn the bridge you are standing on, especially if the man holding the matches owns the river underneath. Respect isn't demanded. It's commanded by those who hold the deed to the truth. If you believe that a man should always protect his dignity and his legacy, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what you would have done in my shoes. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice and the strength of the silent builder. Thank you for listening.